Not every story begins with a battle. Some begin with a door that never locks, a bowl of yesterday's stew, and the hush of a world too quiet for history to notice. Tonight we travel back, not to castles or kings, but to the flickering edge of a forgotten village, a place where the earth speaks louder than words, where time moves like mist, and where no one remembers the village's name. As you settle in, feel free to leave a like or subscribe if these quiet moments bring you peace. It helps us keep telling stories like this, unhurried, unwritten, and gently unfolding. You won't need to stay awake, just rest your head and let your mind wander into the soft, slow rhythm of life long ago. The kind of life history left behind, but memory never quite let go. The village with no name. Not every place is marked on a map. This one never was. If it had a name, no one says it anymore. It sits like a fold in the earth, tucked between thick trees and low hills, the kind of place you reach not by direction, but by accident. A village built out of necessity, not ambition. The land here isn't rich, but it's just enough to dig into, just enough to hold on to, just enough to survive. You were born here, and unless the sky tears open, or a lord gets curious, you'll die here, likely within sight of the door you first crawled through. Maybe 60 steps from one end of your life to the other. The homes hunch low to the earth, like they're trying not to be noticed. They lean, always slightly, always into the wind. Their walls are made from wattle and daub. That is a kind of patient weaving of mud, straw and sticks. Each crack patched with the same quiet persistence that fills the lives of those who live inside. The roofs are thick with thatch browned by smoke and rain, and always a little damp to the touch. Inside it smells of wood smoke, old wool, wet earth, a scent you'll never quite notice, because it's just the air you breathe. There are no roads, only a pair of muddy grooves where ox carts have passed enough times to leave a trail, and they don't lead anywhere. Not really, because no one leaves. Not unless they're carried out or chased out, and even then it's usually to the next village, which is more rumor than destination. The next village, a phrase used like a charm, like a threat, like a fable. You've never seen it. You're not sure anyone has. Time here is soft around the edges. There are no clocks, no bells unless the wind is just right, and carries a distant chime from a chapel you've never visited. You measure your days by the light, the ache in your back, the sound of birds shifting in the hedges. Your calendar is written in seasons: mud season, lambing season, the season when everything grows too fast, and the season when it all dies back again. The village is small, maybe a dozen families, maybe less. It's hard to keep track, and no one tries too hard. Everyone knows everyone else, and knows when to pretend they don't. You share tools, share bread, share the same patched complaints about the weather. There's no tavern, no school, no church of your own, just people, and habits, and the slow erosion of time. There's an elder, sort of, his name is Tom. Once long ago he spoke to a monk, or says he did, and that's enough for people to nod when he talks. His goats look healthy, and his roof hasn't collapsed, so who are you to question him? Arguments here are quiet and short, usually solved with a shrug or a gift of onions, or a shared chore. Land disputes are resolved with references to trees, that elm, that patch of soft ground. Nothing is official, nothing is written, but somehow it holds. If a stranger comes, and that only happens maybe once a decade, it's the biggest event in living memory. Everyone talks. Are they cursed? Do they smell of salt? Did they really come from the next village? What does that even mean? For a few weeks, nothing is more important, but they always leave, or vanish, or become one of you, which is the same thing. You've heard of cities, places of stone and height and endless noise, but you've never seen one, and truthfully, you don't want to. Roads are for travelers, and travelers are for stories. You don't need stories. You have sheep to mind, a roof to mend, a stew that's been bubbling for 3 days. That's the shape of life. That's its flavor. Most days you walk the same paths, to the well, to the field, to the shed, to the neighbor with the good turnips. You might walk 10,000 steps, but in truth, you move in a circle, the same circle your parents walked, the same circle your children might, and yet, there's something beautiful about it, something quiet, something that doesn't need glory or gold. There's peace in the predictable, in knowing the smell of your home, in watching the same sun rise over the same hills, in knowing which birds return first after the frost. News comes late, if it comes at all. A king has died, or married, or declared a war, it doesn't matter. You don't know what he looks like, you don't know what he does, but you say his name in prayer, just in case it matters to someone. There's a steward who visits. Sometimes, he writes things down, asks how many sacks of grain. You answer but never in too much detail. He doesn't like detail, and detail doesn't help you. Instead you look to the sky, you listen to the ground, you know when it will rain, not by science, but by the way the chickens move. You know when to gather the sheep, not by a rule, but by the itch behind your eyes. These are the things that keep you alive, not laws, not lords, and somehow that's enough. The thatch glows in the afternoon sun, the hearth still burns. You have calloused hands but steady ones. You don't count years, you count winters survived. You count loaves shared, you count the nights the roof held. And tonight, like every night, you lie down, and you listen to the stillness. And for a while, there's no need to think of tomorrow, because tomorrow will be much the same. And in that sameness, there is rest, and in that rest, maybe even a little joy. So close your eyes, let the rhythm of old footsteps carry you, and drift gently back into the slow dream of the village with no name. Smoke in the morning cold. It's colder than it was yesterday. The kind of cold that doesn't care what season it's supposed to be. The kind that finds its way through shutters and settles in the joints of the old. You wake slowly, curled near the coals you banked the night before, your breath a pale ribbon in the still air. Outside, a low mist has wrapped itself around the village, like a blanket the world forgot to shake off. Somewhere a hen complains softly, and across the path, a door creaks open on tired hinges. You wrap your fingers around a wooden cup, thin broth reheated from last night, and listen. Smoke rises in faint ribbons from the thatch. The world is waking, whether it wants to or not. Your feet touch the floor, and it's always colder than you expect. The thatch still drips from the last rain, and the hearthstone is warm only in the places closest to the coals. You step carefully, pulling a rough wool tunic over your head, one sleeve stitched where the elbow wore through 2 winters ago. Everything you own is mended, and everything mended will need mending again. Outside, the morning has the color of old iron, not quite light, not quite dark, just a smeared grey sky, and a sharp smell of ash and damp leaves. The village is quiet in the way it always is, before the real labor begins. The sound of a dull axe carries from somewhere near the tree line, slow and unhurried. Whoever it is isn't in a rush. There's no reason to be. The work will still be there, and rushing just means more pain tomorrow. You pass the goat pen. One of them bleats at you like it's telling a joke only goats understand. You don't laugh, but you nod at it. That's enough. The fence still leans where the last storm softened the posts. You'll fix it eventually, maybe when your hands are warm again. Past the elder's house, someone's tending a fire. The smoke is thick and sweet, peat. You think, there's not much good wood left nearby, and you can't remember the last time someone split a clean log. Mostly it's scrub now. Twisted things that burn quick and spit sparks. You smell boiled turnips and burnt bread. That'll be breakfast for someone. It might be yours too, depending on what's left. At the well the rope creaks. Wilkin is drawing water, half asleep and shivering. He nods when he sees you, but neither of you say anything. What's there to say? You've both been doing this for as long as you can remember. Words are wasted when the day has only just begun. There are no clocks here. You measure time by the way the frost melts off the roof, by how far your shadow stretches when you bend to lift something heavy. The chapel bell is too far to hear most days, and the sun doesn't always cooperate. You know it's morning because your bones say it is, and that's good enough. Today you'll dig, not a big patch, just a corner of the garden, where the soil feels less like stone. The last frost might be behind you, or it might not. You'll know when something sprouts, or doesn't. That's how farming works here. You try, and you hope, and you try again. Your neighbor old Marjorie is muttering to her chickens. She does that even when no one else is around. Says it keeps them laying. You're not sure it works, but she's been here longer than anyone else, and her roof doesn't leak as much as yours does, so maybe she knows something you don't. In the distance a crow calls once, twice, and then goes quiet. You look toward the tree line, but there's nothing moving. The forest stays still, just as well. No one wants anything coming out of the forest, nothing that leaves footprints anyway. Inside again you hang your cloak near the hearth, and press your hands close to the warmth. The fire needs more wood, but you don't have much left, just a few damp branches and the last of the good kindling. You stack it carefully, waste nothing. That's the rule here, even the wind follows it, it only takes what's loose. The day will unfold slowly, it always does. Maybe the steward will arrive, maybe not. If he does, you'll nod, answer what you're asked, and avoid being noticed. That's the goal, not to stand out, not to speak too much, to be another patch of earth, another stone in the field. Evening will come with its same quiet hush, a bowl of stew, a cracked bowl, if you're not careful, and a fire, if the wind hasn't eaten it. Then sleep, not because you're tired, though you are, but because it's dark, and there's nothing else to do. You'll lie down on the same straw, under the same roof, listening to the same wind that's always been here. And you'll drift off the same way people have for centuries, not quickly, but slowly, gently, as if the land is pulling you back into itself, asking nothing of you but to rest, and when tomorrow comes, you'll do it all again. Not because you have to, but because it's what there is, and somehow, in the rhythm of it, there's a strange kind of peace, not loud, not glorious. Just enough, just enough. The bread, and the silence. There's a silence to early morning bread that's different from any other kind of quiet. It's thick, almost sacred, broken only by the soft thud of a wooden bowl set down, or the whisper of flour dust drifting through cold air. You wake before the sun does, not because you want to, but because the dough won't wait. It has its own rules, its own way of pulling you from sleep. The hearth is barely warm, and your hands are stiff, but there's work to be done, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that doesn't ask for thanks, just steady hands, and time. The flour isn't good. It never is. A little coarse, always with a few husks, that made it through the sieve. You learnt a long time ago not to mind. You mix it with water drawn late last night, when the moon was low and the well was quiet. No one bothers you then, that's when you think best. If thinking is even the right word, it's more like remembering. You add salt. Not much, salt's precious, and what you have came from a peddler whose name no one could pronounce. Traded for wool, or a bit of meat. You don't remember what you gave up, only that you gave it. That's how things work here. No coin, just exchanges, weighted by need. You knead in silence. The dough presses back with a quiet strength, like something half asleep. You don't rush. You can't. The fire isn't hot enough yet, and you still need to check the ashes for embers. No one told you how to do this. You just learned, the way everyone learns, watching, guessing, failing quietly enough that no one noticed. Outside the light begins to change, not sunrise, not quite, just the dark softening around the edges, like the world is slowly waking and stretching its limbs. You hear someone cough down the lane, and a pig grunting as if annoyed to be awake. But mostly it's still, even the birds seem unsure whether it's worth it to sing. You set the dough aside to rise near the hearth, and wrap it in an old cloth. There's a crack in the wall that lets in a thin blade of air. You cover it with a folded tunic, the same one you'll wear later, once it's dry from yesterday's rain. Time passes here in uneven chunks, not by clocks, but by tasks. You wait for the dough to rise. You clean the table, you trim a fraying cord on your boot. You listen for footsteps that never come. You stir the coals, you don't count the minutes. There's no need, eventually the dough feels right. Not too sticky, not too firm. You shape it into rounds, not perfect, but good enough. You set them on a flat stone warmed near the fire. No oven here, just a clever way of arranging heat, stones and patience. The smell comes slowly, first a hint of warmth, then that rich, yeasty comfort that makes even the goats pause and sniff the air. It's a smell that means survival. It's a small good thing in a world that rarely offers those. You tear a piece when it's cool enough. The crust is uneven, and the inside is still dense, but it's bread, and it's yours. You eat it standing up, leaning against the wall, watching the smoke drift from the roof across the way. Marjorie is feeding her chickens again. You wonder if they listen, or if they're just pretending to. There are days when you wonder about other places. Not often, but sometimes. You've heard bread is different in cities, softer, taller, baked in deep ovens with chimneys made of stone. They use herbs sometimes, even spices. You've never tasted a spice, but you've seen drawings of them. Curled things, strange colors. Expensive, if the stories are true, but you don't need that. Not really. You have fire, you have grain, you have quiet. And when the bread is warm and the wind is still, that feels like enough. You save a piece for later. Wrap it carefully in a bit of cloth that used to be part of a curtain. You haven't had curtains in years. But the fabric holds scent well, and sometimes when you unwrap it again at midday, the bread still smells like smoke and warmth. The rest of the day will come. It always does. There will be fences to fix, someone's thatch to patch, or maybe just more silence to carry. But for now, you've made bread, and for a moment, nothing else matters. You close your eyes and let the warmth linger. The world is still small, still quiet, still holding together in the way old things do, not with strength, but with persistence. And in that stillness, in that quiet breath before the next task begins, you feel something settle. Not joy, not pride, just peace. A soft, low peace, like the sound of loaves cooling on a stone, faint, familiar. Enough. And with that, the morning moves on, as it always does. The threads, and the quiet hands. You wouldn't think a spindle could hold the weight of a whole day, but it does. It turns slow, pulled by hands that barely move, over and over again. Twist, pull, wind. Twist, pull, wind. That's how time passes here. Not by bells or chimes or ticking things, but by the soft whisper of thread forming from wool and the quiet breath of someone who's done this more times than she's ever counted. The wool isn't clean. It never is. You pick burrs from it one by one, your fingers quick and practiced, little seeds, tiny bones of thistle, all clinging to the fleece like it doesn't want to let go of the sheep it came from. You remember the shearing, weeks ago now, the bleating, the laughter, the way the sheep trembled under the blade, but didn't run. No one does, really. There's nowhere to run to. You sit near the hearth, because that's where the light is best, and the draft doesn't reach your bones as sharply. The spindle is smooth, worn down by your mother's hands, and her mother's before that. You never met them, but you know them, in the way hands know tools, in the way routines carry names, even after the mouths that spoke them have long gone quiet. You're not spinning for beauty. There's no dye, no loom. This thread is for mending, mostly, for patching worn elbows and knees that carry the weight of too much field work, for weaving a cord strong enough to tie a gate closed, for replacing what the world wears out faster than you can afford to replace. There's always more to fix, always more to hold together. Outside, someone is calling to a child. The child doesn't answer, but you hear feet in the mud, and the clatter of a bucket, half full of water. The well's slow today, the rope sticks, the winch groans. You make a note to check it later, though you already know there's no time. Twist, pull, wind. You glance at the sky through the gap in the shutter. Grey again, always grey, but not rain, not yet. Just the kind of sky that makes you want to stay near the fire, even if it's only pretending to be warm. Your brother walks past, muddy to the knees, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He nods but doesn't stop. There's never time to stop. Not really. He'll want new thread later. You'll give it to him, even if you haven't finished the roll you need for yourself. That's what this place teaches you. You're not alone, but you are solitary. Everyone's too busy with their own thread to untangle yours, but they'll hold it for you, sometimes, just for a moment, just long enough. You hum softly, a tune with no name. You think you heard it once at a feast, or maybe it's just the one your hands make when the spindle turns right. It helps the rhythm, keeps your mind from wandering too far. Sometimes you wonder about the faraway cloth you've heard about. Silks, they call them. Linens. Threads dyed blue like summer skies and red like berries you've never tasted. You wonder what it's like to wear something soft, something meant only for warmth or beauty, not for labor. You can't picture it, but still you wonder. You wrap the finished thread into a coil. It's uneven. It always is, but it will hold. That's what matters. That's what everything is, really. Holding, mending, spinning something out of nothing. Someone passes your door and pauses. It's old Tom, leaning on his stick like always. He asks if you've got any twine left. You don't, not yet, but you tell him soon. He nods, not because he heard, but because he's used to being told soon. That's enough for now. You tuck the spindle away, stretch your back, and run your fingers through what's left of the fleece. Still so much to do. But that's tomorrow's work. Tonight, maybe there will be stew. Maybe the roof won't leak. Maybe the fire will hold its glow until you drift off. You press your palm against the coil of thread. It's rough, but warm, real. A small thing, but a thing you made. Something true. and in the hush that follows, as the fire dims and the world narrows back into its soft corners, you feel the stillness settle around you. The kind that doesn't ask questions, the kind that doesn't need answers, just the soft weight of a spindle, the rhythm of quiet hands, and the peace of knowing that tomorrow you'll do it all again, and that will be enough. The well beneath the tree. There's a sound water makes when it rises from stone, a hush, like breath caught in the throat of the earth. Not loud, not showy, a whisper, soft as wool, old as the bones of the hills. You've heard it since you were small, though you didn't always notice. Before you understood what thirst was, before you knew that water didn't just appear, but had to be coaxed up from the quiet, secret places where the land hides its treasures. The well doesn't speak often, but when it does, it murmurs stories only the quietest ears can hear. It stands at the far edge of the village, just past the slope where the brambles grow thick and the soil turns a pale, stony grey. You could almost miss it, tucked beneath the arms of an ash tree whose limbs stretch outward like they're sheltering something precious. The well is nothing grand, no carved stones or painted saints, no crest or chisel mark to say who made it. Just a low ring of old rocks, round as a cauldron, half covered in moss and lichen, leaning in together like the shoulders of old friends huddled around a fading fire. Above it, the ash tree. Its bark is scarred and twisted, as if it's lived through long winters and longer silence. Its roots curl down into the earth and wrap around the well's base like fingers, as if it too is drinking from whatever flows below. You come here most mornings. The bucket's heavy, heavier than you remember. Or maybe your arms are just tired from 100 other tasks. The rope is frayed but still holds. You lower the bucket hand over hand, each rotation squeaking gently against the worn wooden spindle. It vanishes into shadow, then into silence, then into that hush, the sound of water receiving the weight of the bucket, like a sigh. You pause, not for fear, there's no danger here. Just habit. You always pause after the splash. You listen, the water has a voice, if you let yourself hear it. Not words, just presence, like something ancient reminding you it's still there, still waiting. You've heard different stories about the well, no one agrees on its beginning. Some say a wandering monk found this place and dug down with nothing but his hands and a blessing. Others say the earth cracked open after a storm and the water poured out on its own, as if the land was offering it freely, if only once. Children tell stories of wishes whispered into the depths, of lost things returned, of secret voices echoing up at night. Some say the tree speaks when the bucket touches bottom. Others say, if you look into the well at dusk, you'll see a face looking back, not yours. You've never seen it. But you don't look too long either. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Water deserves silence, especially this kind. You raise the bucket carefully, arms steady, breath even. The rope creaks and groans with each turn, the spindle clicking as it winds. The sound is comforting, the same every time, no matter the season, rain or sun, hunger or harvest. This part never changes. You pull the weight up and over the rim, let it rest for a moment. The water inside is still and clear, with a faint shimmer that doesn't quite match the light above. You fill your jug, spill a little on your boots. That's expected. The well splashes back, like it always does. The ground around it is never dry, even in the driest months. It's as if the land itself knows not to let this place go thirsty. You turn to leave, but not immediately. You always sit here for a little while, just a few moments with your back against the tree and your jug at your side. From here you can see most of the village, low roofs that slump toward the earth like old dogs, smoke curling soft and grey from the chimneys. A cartwheel leans against a fence, a hen scratches in the mud, a child calls to a dog that doesn't listen. The kind of things that don't make news, but make a life. Behind you, the tree creaks softly in the breeze, or maybe it's not the wind. Maybe it's the tree itself shifting, slowly, lazily, like it's dreaming. Old Marjorie swears the tree grows in circles, that it leans slightly more each year, bending toward the well, like a listener leaning toward a whisper. Tom, who says little, and listens less, says it's just a tree. You don't argue with either of them. Some things are best left undecided. You follow the muddy track back toward the center of the village. The path is worn, the kind of worn that can't be fixed, only used. It remembers every step you've ever taken. You pass the fence that needs mending, the trough that never quite holds water, the goat that always seems to be watching. You carry the bucket carefully, though not urgently. Nothing is urgent here. There's no rush, only rhythm. Inside, the cottage is dim. The hearth glows with yesterday's coals, waiting for you to feed it. You pour a little water into the pot hanging from the hook. Soup again. Always soup. You stir the embers with the iron poker, listen to the soft hiss as water touches heat. The fire murmurs to life, slow and content. You sit down by the door, the bucket beside you. Outside, the day moves forward at its usual pace. A chicken calls, someone coughs, a dog barks once and goes quiet again. It's not silence. Not really, just a different kind of sound, one that doesn't demand anything from you. You remember, suddenly, when you first carried water from the well, you were small. The bucket was half your size. Someone taller walked beside you, one hand on the handle, the other on your shoulder. You don't remember who. Maybe your mother, maybe a cousin long since buried. You only remember the feel of the water sloshing, the weight of it shifting, the pride of not spilling too much. Funny what the body remembers when the mind forgets. Later you'll ladle the soup, share it with whoever knocks, patch the roof again, mend the torn sleeve, but not now. Now you sit, the well is full, the tree is quiet. The air smells of ash and damp soil, and somewhere far beyond the hills, the world spins and changes and forgets you. That's all right. Here, at the edge of things, nothing needs to be remembered. The bucket is full, the fire is warm. And for now, that's enough. Sleep comes in places like this, not as a guest, but as a neighbor. Familiar, welcome, quiet. It doesn't knock, it doesn't ask. It just sits beside you, shoulder to shoulder, like the moss-covered stones of the well, leaning in, holding steady, and saying nothing at all. Smoke from the west field. It was still early when the first threads of smoke began to rise above the western hedgerow. Not the thick black smoke of fear or ruin, but the thin, wavering kind, a ribbon of grey that curled and danced on the morning air. Too slow to be urgent, too quiet to be a call. Still, smoke always meant something, even when it meant nothing, and eyes turned toward it all the same. The west field lay far beyond the boundary stones, where the village ended and the wild began. Not wild like the forests to the north, with their twisting paths and stories better left untold, but a quiet, overgrown kind of wild, the kind that comes when no one's looking. The field hadn't been sown in 2 years, not since the stones began shifting and the stream that once fed the soil turned dry. They said it was cursed, or barren, or simply tired. Fields, like people, can go quiet for a while, and like people, they can be coaxed back with time. No one claimed the smoke, no fire had been lit there by your hand, nor by any you'd spoken to that morning. The baker hadn't seen it, the shepherd hadn't heard of it, and the tanner, who watched everything, whether he meant to or not, simply frowned and looked away when asked. So, after breaking your fast, just barley bread and a few last slices of apple, you set out toward the west field, more curious than cautious. The air was still cool, touched with the wetness of dew, and the faint, sweet scent of something turning green again. The sky was the kind of grey that held no storm, only stillness. You passed the edge of the sheepfold, where the ewes blinked at you slowly, chewing grass with the contentment of beasts who've never asked why. The path was barely a path now. Weeds had begun to stitch themselves across the old footfalls, and bramble reached out from the hedgerow like it remembered your name. You stepped carefully, but not quickly. There was no need. The smoke waited. As you walked, the sounds of the village faded, the clatter of pots, the caw of rooks, the creak of wood on wood, replaced now by quieter things. The rustle of dry leaves, the hum of insects still sleepy from the night, the far-off cry of something, a fox perhaps, answering nothing in particular. The field appeared gradually. First the old fence, half fallen, its timbers softened by rain and sun, then the edge of the clearing, where the grass grew tall and pale, and then, at last, the heart of the field, where the smoke rose slow and thin from a ring of stones you didn't remember building. Someone had made a fire, not large, just enough to boil a pot or warm a pair of hands. The coals still glowed faintly, and the ashes whispered in the breeze. Beside it, a stool, rough-hewn, 3-legged, damp from the night. Empty, there were footprints, just a few, leading in, but not out. You didn't feel fear, not exactly. Just a kind of watchfulness, like the land was holding its breath. You waited a moment, then sat on the stool. The wood creaked beneath your weight. The fire gave a small sigh of warmth. There was a pot too, empty, but clean. No soot on its rim, no scalded scent. Someone had tended it carefully, not a traveler. Then, travelers left things messy. Whoever had sat here knew this place, or remembered it. You looked around. The field was quiet. No movement in the grass, no breath of wind, just the steady, slow fading of the smoke as it unwound itself into the sky like a question with no answer. You stayed longer than you meant to. The stillness held you. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't sad. Just deep, like sleep you hadn't known you needed. You closed your eyes once, just for a blink, but the blink stretched. When you opened them again, the smoke was gone, the coals had cooled, and yet, the stool beneath you was still warm. You stood, slowly. Your limbs felt light, as if something had passed through you and taken a burden with it. You didn't know what, but you were grateful. Before leaving, you knelt beside the old fence and pulled up a single weed, roots and all. You brushed the soil from your hands and walked back toward the village, one step at a time. When you returned, the sky had brightened just slightly. The sheep blinked again, as if they'd never seen you go. The baker had set out a tray of oatcakes. The tanner was still frowning, but now at a different question. You said nothing about the stool, or the smoke, or the footprints. But later that evening, just before dusk, you walked to the edge of the garden and planted a single seed from last year's harvest, right in the soil where nothing had grown for seasons. You didn't say a blessing. You didn't need to. Some things answer only silence. And when you turned back, you thought, though you couldn't be sure, that you saw a curl of smoke, far out beyond the field, drifting once again. The stranger's spoon. It started with a spoon, not a remarkable one. Not the kind you'd find in the hands of a lord, or even a merchant. Just a simple wooden spoon, slightly curved, smooth at the handle, carved with a hand that took quiet pride in quiet things. You found it beside the well, half buried in the loose clay, just where the bucket thumped when drawn too fast. At first you thought it might be yours. You've misplaced things before. But the wood was different, warmer, lighter. Not from any tree you'd carved. No one in the village recognized it either. Not Tom the elder, not the baker's boy, not Marjorie who swore she knew every spoon this side of the ridge. That's how things were here. Every item had a place, every person, a role, every piece of wood, a story, but not this spoon. You turned it over in your hands. It had been used, you could tell, the bowl of it worn smooth, the edge dulled by years of broth and porridge. But there were no cracks, no rot. Someone had cared for it. That night, around the communal hearth, the conversation drifted in slow circles. Smoke curled above the fire pit. A pot of something simple, lentils, maybe, simmered gently, the scent of thyme and turnip soft in the air. You held the spoon, and listened. No one confessed to owning it. No one even wanted it. But when you asked if anyone new had passed through recently, the room shifted. Eyes turned elsewhere. The way they do when truth starts to ripple beneath the surface of a still pond. Could be from the winter man, someone muttered. You asked who that was, and they shrugged. Not really a man, came the answer. More like a story with boots. He was said to walk in late autumn, or just after the last frost, always alone, always passing through, never knocking, never speaking, just there, and then gone. People claimed to see footprints, a scarf caught in a hedge, an old coin on a doorstep, nothing more. No one remembered his face, only that something shifted in the days after. Fences mended themselves, goats stopped limping, firewood seemed to last longer. No one claimed to know why, or how, just that it happened, and just as quietly, it didn't anymore. So you kept the spoon, not for any reason, just because it felt like it should be kept. In the days that followed, small things began to happen. You noticed the latch on your door no longer creaked when you opened it. The pot you patched last spring finally held water again. Your neighbor, who'd limped since harvest, stood a little straighter when he waved to you across the lane. No one said anything, not directly, but there was a feeling in the air, like the breath before snowfall, calm, expectant. On the third day, someone knocked at your door. You opened it slowly, expecting nothing, finding only a small sack left on the step. Inside dried herbs, a needle of unusually fine make, and a twist of cloth that smelled faintly of cedar. No note. You showed it to Tom, who blinked slowly and said, "Winter man's not real," and then told you to burn the herbs just in case. But you didn't. You dried them in the rafters instead. That evening, while walking the long edge of the field, you saw the faintest mark in the mud. Just one boot print, a bit too long, a bit too narrow, the kind that wouldn't last a full hour before the wind erased it. And next to it, a broken branch, twisted into a shape you almost recognized, like a rune, or a letter, or a memory. When you returned to your cottage, the spoon was gone. You searched, of course, looked under the bench, behind the hearth, in the folds of the blanket, where you sometimes tucked small things, but it wasn't there. You didn't tell anyone, not because you were afraid, but because you didn't want the story to collapse under questions. A week passed, then another, and the world returned to its normal rhythm, of scraping bowls and stretching grain, of patching roofs and tending sheep. But now and then, just as you slipped into sleep, you thought you heard a single knock, not loud, not urgent, just present. And sometimes, when walking the path behind the chapel, where the stones run mossy and soft, you find a curl of wood, thin as a ribbon, resting gently on the ground, still warm, and you wonder, not with fear, but with a calm sort of awe, what else might be walking the world when no one's looking. The candle and the hollow stone. There is a place behind the village no one talks about unless the weather is bad or the chores are done early, and even then, only in murmurs. A short walk beyond the last row of fields, just where the forest begins to breathe more heavily and the moss grows thicker than the grass, lies a hollow stone. You've seen it before, of course. Everyone has, but no one lingers there long. It isn't especially large, just a stone, wide and shallow, with a bowl-like dip in the middle, smoothed as if water once moved across it for 100 years, then stopped one day and never returned. No markings, no carvings, just the faint scent of damp ash when the wind shifts. Some say it used to be a boundary marker, back before boundaries mattered. Others whisper that it's older than the forest, older even than the soil itself, that it fell from the sky when the world was still deciding what shape to take. Children dare each other to touch it, and then run laughing down the slope, wiping their fingers against their tunics, as if something might cling. You never gave it much thought, until the night of the candle. It had been an ordinary evening. Sky dimming, stew bubbling, smoke curling gently from the thatch. You had just settled in to patch a bit of wool when you noticed it. A flicker of light beyond the trees, not fire, not large enough for that. Just a small, steady flame, low to the ground, unmoving. You stood at the doorway for a long time, waiting to see if it would vanish, waiting to see if it might have been a trick of the eyes, or the moon catching dew. But it stayed. And so, drawn by the quiet kind of curiosity that sometimes stirs when the world slows down, you stepped into your boots and walked out into the chill. The forest was still, no birds, no wind, only the soft crunch of leaves and the rhythmic creak of your own breath. When you reached the stone, the candle was still burning, nestled in the hollow, exactly centered, the wick bright but calm. It didn't sputter, it didn't flicker, it just burned. No wax around it, no holder, just the candle, and the flame, and the stone beneath it, barely warm. You looked around, half expecting someone to step out from behind a tree, to reveal the trick, but the forest remained empty, watching, in its own silent way. You didn't touch it. Instead, you sat a few steps back and waited, for what you weren't sure, but it felt wrong to leave too quickly. You stayed until the flame burned down into nothing, and in the silence that followed, you could have sworn the ground beneath you exhaled. The next morning, you told no one. And yet, somehow, the baker left an extra loaf on your step. The miller's wheel, which had groaned for weeks, spun smooth again, and the winter root cellar, which you'd sealed against mice with nothing but cloth and twine, stayed unspoiled. You began to pass the stone more often, after that, not every day, and never at night, but enough that you began to notice the subtle ways the earth shifted around it. A new mushroom here, a fox print there, once a single red feather, resting upright in the grass as if left on purpose. Others seemed to feel it, too. The elder, Tom, limped past it one morning, and muttered something under his breath you couldn't hear. The shepherd's dog refused to go near it at all. One child, curious and braver than most, left a sprig of lavender in the hollow. The next week, her fever broke after a month of illness. Her mother said it was the time tea, but you saw the look she gave the woods after. Somewhere along the way, you started leaving things too, quiet things. A stone you found with a perfect hole through it, a bit of beeswax, a carved button, never large, never loud, always gone by morning. No one said anything, but once after you left a strand of dried rosemary, you returned to find a circle of pale blue stones around the hollow, not arranged, not precise, but present, like fingers curled gently around the edge of something sleeping, and you began to wonder, not with fear, not with urgency, but with that slow kind of curiosity that sits behind the ribs. What else lived here, long before the village? long before names, long before roads carved the land into portions. The forest never answered you, but it never pushed you away, either. And on some evenings, when the air is still and your thoughts are slow, you light a single candle in your window, just one, not because you expect anything, but because something long ago taught you that light carries farther than sound, and because in a world full of noise and labor and ache, a quiet question is sometimes more powerful than an answer. The bell without a tower. They say that somewhere nearby, not far, but not close enough to point to, there is a bell that rings without a tower. No one can agree on where it is, or when it sounds, only that it does. It never tolls at the hour, not like the chapel bells in the next village over. It doesn't chime for deaths or births or feast days. Instead, it rings in strange moments, just once, a deep, clear tone, soft as a sigh, and heavy as thunder, then silence again. And when it happens, no one speaks of it, for long. Some say it's buried, that once, long ago, a monastery fell into the earth and was swallowed whole, and the bell is all that remains, echoing through roots and soil. Others believe it's hung in the trees, tied with some vine you cannot see, swinging only when the world forgets to notice. A few claim it's not a bell at all, but the earth itself, groaning in a way that sounds like iron. You've heard it twice, maybe 3 times, always at dusk, always when you were alone. Once while gathering kindling beneath the old chestnut tree, another while mending a fence near the sheep pens. Each time it came from no direction you could trace. It simply arrived. A soft resonance that filled the space between your ribs, and then vanished before you could tell whether it had been real. You asked Tom the elder, once, just once, he said, that best not to listen too closely. And then he went back to sharpening his blade, as if you'd asked nothing at all, but you did listen. You always have. It isn't the sort of bell that frightens, if anything it comforts. Its sound settles into the bones of things, into wood and stone and the soft space behind the eyes, and you feel, just for a moment, like you're being called somewhere, not urgently, not even necessarily to move, just called. The sound stays with you, like the smell of rain before it falls, like the memory of your mother's voice, even though she's been gone so long you no longer remember her face. You begin to notice other signs, a crow, still as a statue, perched for hours on a roof beam and staring out toward the woods, a ring of frost on the grass, even when the air is mild, a trail of dried berries laid out in a curve, as if something had left them in offering or in warning. Each time the bell rings, something small seems to shift. The last time, a wild dog limped into the village and sat outside the baker's door for 3 days, never barked, never begged, just stared. When it left, it limped no more, and once long after sunset, you heard it, the bell, from your bed. You hadn't been asleep yet, just on the edge, drifting, and the tone pulled you back, gently, like a familiar hand on your shoulder, a reminder of something though you didn't know what. You didn't rise, you didn't even open your eyes, but you whispered thanks, not sure why, not even sure to whom. The morning after, your tools were already set by the door, though you don't remember placing them there. And your water bucket, usually empty by dawn, was full and still cool. You asked no one, because something deep inside you understood that there are gifts in this world not meant to be repaid, only respected. And so, now and then, when you feel the air grow heavy and the shadows begin to move more slowly, you stop, just for a breath, just for a moment, you stop and listen. Because somewhere, a bell is ringing, not for war, not for warning, but for remembering. And though you may never find its tower, never see the rope or the hand that pulls it, you carry its sound, quietly, carefully, like a promise made in the dark. Beneath the ashen sky. The day begins with the sky, the color of cooled ash, soft gray, stretched thin and high, with no promise of rain but no sun either. That kind of in-between sky, the kind that makes no decisions, and expects none from you. It's a sky you've known and come to trust. One that doesn't press you for answers, or hurry you along. It doesn't mind if you take your time. The fields around you are quiet today. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the deep, almost inaudible hum of the earth, as if it too is waking up slowly. The crops that grow here, stubborn and strong, sway under the weight of their own quiet struggle. The wheat is tall but not ready for harvest yet. It will bend later when the sun finally breaks through. For now it stands still, like everything else in the village. The air smells of damp earth, of things that grow and die in their own time. The scent is rich and thick, not unpleasant, but deeply rooted. like something ancient and forgotten. It's the smell of being alive, in a way that doesn't ask for attention. There's the faint sound of footsteps, soft against the packed earth. It's you, it's always you in the mornings. First to rise and begin the work that everyone else will follow. There's no need to hurry, it's a slow kind of work, the kind that you've learned to understand over the years. It doesn't need to be done quickly, just done, and done right. You move from task to task without thinking much about it. The animals need their care, the chickens, the goats, the old tired ox. There's a rhythm to it all, a flow that makes the day feel as if it's one long continuous movement, with no sharp breaks or interruptions. The work is simple but necessary, and it fills the hours between sunup and sundown in ways that feel comforting, even if sometimes it's exhausting. There's no hurry to finish, because the work will always be there, and in that there's a kind of peace. The small village feels as if it's part of the landscape, like a rock tucked against the side of a hill. It's been here for generations, and it will stay here for generations more, weathering the changes that come from a distance but never really affected by them. The world outside is something you've heard of, something that doesn't make much sense when you try to picture it. The village is home, the trees are home, the ground beneath your feet, the scent of the forest after a rain, the birds that call as they fly overhead. These things are what matter, and these things, in their quiet way, remind you that you belong. There's something to be said for this kind of life, the rhythm of it, the simplicity. You don't need to know much. You know the seasons, the weather, the faces of the people around you. You know the shape of the land, the way the hills fold into the distance, the way the forest waits quietly at the edge of everything. You know how to plant, how to harvest, how to feed the animals. You know the old stories, the ones passed down through whispered words on long nights by the fire. You know when the crops are due to come in, and when the frost will bite at your fingers. But beyond that, there's not much to think about. The rest of the world feels like a story you've only heard pieces of. There's talk of kings and battles, of great cities with walls as tall as trees and men who ride horses made of iron. But those are stories. They don't feel real. What's real is here, beneath the ash-colored sky, where the land meets the horizon in a slow curve, and the day stretches out in quiet, endless minutes. The small tasks fill the day, chopping wood, fixing fences, tending to the fire. It's not glamorous work. In fact, it can be tiring. But there's something about it that feels right. There's a kind of calm in the repetition, a kind of peace in knowing what's expected of you. The small problems that arise are easily solved. A loose nail, a stubborn ox that refuses to move. You take care of it, and then you move on. There's time for little things too. A moment by the stream, watching the water trickle by. A chance to sit and listen to the quiet, to feel the stillness of the world around you. The only interruptions come from the animals, the occasional chatter of the neighbors, the rustling of the trees. It's a rhythm you've come to depend on, a rhythm that keeps the world moving even when nothing changes. The sun is low now, the light soft and golden, spreading a quiet warmth over everything. The shadows lengthen across the field, stretching slowly toward the hills. The day is winding down, the air growing cooler, and still there's no hurry to get anywhere. The work is done for the day, the fire will be lit soon, the stew stirred, the bread brought out of the oven, and with each small movement, with each small task, you feel the day slipping into night, calm and quiet, just as it always does. The world may be larger than this, but here, in this village, you don't need to know anything else. The rhythm of the days is enough. The soft, slow turning of the world is enough. And when the stars begin to blink faintly above, when the sky finally changes from ash to deep blue, it will be time to rest. Another quiet night, another quiet day ahead. The rhythm continues, steady as always. The edge of the evening. The evening has begun to settle softly over the village. A quiet, soothing shift in the day that's as natural as the breath you take. The world outside is fading into a pale twilight, the sky deepening to a gentle shade of purple, tinged with the last traces of daylight. In the distance, the hills look softer now, their outlines barely visible against the dimming horizon. The quiet of the village is becoming more pronounced, the voices of the day falling away as everyone retreats into their homes. There are no grand ceremonies, no rituals to mark the change of the day. It's simply what happens. The day has done its work, and now the world waits for night to come, calm and unhurried. Inside your small home, the fire crackles quietly, its glow a soft, flickering companion to the settling darkness outside. The hearth, warm and familiar, is a constant in this ever-shifting rhythm of life. The The smell of burning wood mingles with the earthy scent of the stone walls, and the flickering light casts long shadows across the room. You sit for a moment, watching the fire dance. It's a quiet kind of magic, the way the flames rise and fall, the way they twist and curl before fading away into the shadows. There's a comfort in the simplicity of it all, in the way the world doesn't demand anything from you. No questions, no rushing, just the steady turn of time. The sounds of the village are still there, just quieter now. The occasional voice calls from a neighbor's house, a low murmur that fades into the stillness. The animals are already tucked away in their pens, the chickens huddled close, the goats resting in their small makeshift shelters. There's no hurry, there's no need for hurry. The world doesn't seem to mind that the day is over. You think of the past day, the small tasks that filled the hours, the things that needed attention, a fence to repair, a piece of wood to chop, a child to help with their lessons. Everything feels so simple, so straightforward, but it's these small acts, repeated day after day, that give the village its rhythm. The rhythm that never seems to change, that never falters. Tomorrow will be much the same. The sun will rise, the tasks will repeat themselves, and the cycle will continue. The animals will need their care, the field will need its tending, and the fire will need to burn to keep the cold at bay. It's all a quiet dance, one step after the other, nothing too loud, nothing too fast. Outside, the wind picks up just a little, a soft whisper through the trees, rustling the leaves in that familiar, calming way. The forest is still there, just beyond the edge of the village, waiting patiently. You think of the forest sometimes, of how it seems to hold its secrets, how it wraps itself around the world, like a soft blanket, keeping everything hidden and safe. It doesn't rush, it doesn't demand attention, it just is. You don't know much about the forest, no one in the village does. It's simply a part of the landscape, as much a part of the world as the hills or the sky. It's been there longer than any of you, longer than any of the buildings, longer than the roads or the villages themselves. It holds its stories quietly, tucked away in its deep, dark corners, and yet there's something about it that calls to you. The way it feels timeless, the way it seems to exist without end. It's almost like the world outside of the village is a dream, something you've heard about but never truly seen. The village is real, the forest is real, but the rest of the world, the cities and kingdoms, the things people speak of but never really know, they seem like a distant echo, a story told by the fire, but never truly lived. The evening deepens, and the quiet grows. The last embers of the day's light have gone, leaving only the stars to watch over the world. The air is cooler now, the fire in the hearth becoming the warm center of the room. You settle into the calm of it, the rhythm of the world around you blending with the steady thrum of your own thoughts. Tomorrow will come, but for now it is enough to be here, to sit in the quiet of the evening, to listen to the wind, to hear the low murmur of life outside the walls. The day has ended, and the night stretches out before you, peaceful and unhurried. There's nothing to do now except breathe, and let the world go on as it always does, turning ever so slowly beneath the sky. As the fire burns low, the room grows darker, and the stillness settles deeper into your bones. There's nothing else for now, only the warmth of the fire, the peace of the evening, and the knowledge that tomorrow the rhythm will start again, and for now that is enough. The hollow of the afternoon. The day unfolds slowly, like an old story that never needs to be told, stretched out beneath the soft light of a sun that hangs lazily in the sky. It's quiet, the kind of quiet that fills every space, from the tall trees to the crumbling stone walls, from the rustling fields to the distant hills. Time passes with the gentlest of touches here, each second slipping by unnoticed, as if it were waiting for permission to move on. The warmth of the afternoon sun lingers over the village, wrapping itself around everything in a tender embrace. It's not a harsh heat, but rather a gentle warmth, the kind that sinks deep into the bones and makes everything feel a little softer. The fields lie still, and the trees cast long shadows across the earth, their branches swaying slightly in the light breeze. It's the calmest time of day, a peaceful lull before the shadows fully take over. In the distance you can hear the sound of a scythe cutting through the tall grasses. The workers, bent low in their work, barely make a sound as they move through the fields, their footsteps soft on the earth. Every movement seems effortless, as if they have all the time in the world to complete their tasks. There is no rush, no urgency here, only the slow unfolding of the afternoon. The rhythm of life is almost hypnotic. Work, rest, work again, each task flowing seamlessly into the next. The village itself is just as quiet, You can hear the soft murmur of conversation from the open doorways, the faint clink of metal against wood as someone sharpens a tool or fixes a broken fence. Even the animals seem to know the pace of the day, their soft calls blending with the quiet hum of life around them. The world seems to be held in a delicate balance, like a quiet song that never ends. And yet, amidst all this quiet, there is something deeply alive here. The world feels full, not of noise or movement, but of a deep, unspoken energy that pulses gently beneath everything. It's a life that's grounded in the earth, in the land that holds everything together. Every footstep, every task, every glance around the village, everything feels part of something greater, something that has been going on for longer than anyone can remember. There's a sense of permanence here, as if the land itself has held onto these simple ways for centuries, unchanged by time. You know, somehow, that nothing will ever move too fast. Not here, not in this place. The earth seems to breathe with a quiet certainty. The sun seems to rise and set with the same soft rhythm, and even the trees stand rooted in place, never hurried, always waiting. As the afternoon progresses, the light begins to shift. The sun, once high and bold, now drifts lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the fields. The light deepens, becoming more golden and soft, and the air feels cooler, like a whisper from the evening to come. But still, there is no rush. Nothing hurries to catch up with the turning of the day. The workers finish their tasks and begin to make their way home, slowly and steadily. Their feet leave soft prints in the earth, each step a mark of the day's labor, a reminder of the quiet rhythm that runs through everything here. Some pause for a moment, their hands resting on the worn handles of their tools, their faces turned to the sky, as though they're savoring the last warmth of the sun before it slips away. The air is thick with the smell of earth and hay, of freshly cut grass, and of the distant scent of wood smoke starting to curl up from chimneys. In the distance you can hear the faint sound of children's laughter, a soft reminder that life here continues with every generation. The children run across the fields, barefoot and free, their voices echoing in the stillness. They are a part of this place, just as the earth and the trees are, just as the sky and the sun are. They are the future, but they move in the same slow rhythm as everyone before them. The village, once quiet and still, now hums with the soft sounds of evening preparations. The evening meal will be simple, perhaps some bread, some cheese, a bit of soup if there's any left from yesterday. There's no extravagance here, no need for anything more. What matters is that everyone has enough, just enough, to carry them through the night. The firewood has been stacked, the animals are being herded back into their pens, and the doors of the cottages begin to close as the sky deepens. And even as the day fades, there is a sense of peace that remains, as if the earth itself knows how to settle into the night. The light fades gradually, gently. The sky shifts from a pale blue to a soft, dusky purple, and the first stars begin to blink softly in the distance. It's not a dramatic transition, just a slow, quiet fading, like the closing of a book. The world seems to exhale, the day having been lived with such a gentle grace that now the night can enter without interruption. By now the sun has slipped completely behind the hills, and the village is bathed in the soft, muted light of the twilight. The evening sounds take over, the crackle of a fire starting in the hearth, the soft chatter of families settling in for the night, the gentle rustling of the wind through the trees. The air has grown cooler, and the first tendrils of night's chill creep in, but it's not unpleasant. The coolness is a welcome relief after the warmth of the afternoon. Inside the homes, the firelight flickers softly, casting shadows on the walls and creating a warm, comforting glow. The scent of burning wood fills the air, mingling with the aroma of the evening meal. The sounds of quiet conversation and the occasional clink of dishes fill the small rooms. It's a cozy, intimate atmosphere, one that brings a sense of security, of belonging. As you settle into the rhythm of the evening, you feel the weight of the day slip away. There's no need for hurry, no need for stress. Everything is just as it should be. The world outside may turn and change, but here, in this small corner of the earth, nothing moves faster than it needs to. Nothing is expected of you but to be, to exist, to be part of the quiet, unspoken flow of life. And so the evening wears on slowly, the fire crackles and pops, the stars glitter softly above, and the village settles into the peaceful embrace of the night. The earth, the air, the trees, and the people, all are at rest, together in the quiet rhythm of life. And as the night deepens, you feel yourself drawn toward the warmth of your own hearth, your own small corner of the world, where the quiet is your companion, and sleep is just one step away. The shadow of the evening. As the day shifts into its quieter phase, the gentle glow of late afternoon settles across the village, like a soft blanket. The sun, though still high, seems to lose its earlier urgency, taking on a mellower tone. Shadows lengthen in slow motion, stretching across the fields as if time itself has softened. There's a certain tranquility that comes with this part of the day, when everything seems to pause, just for a moment to breathe in the calm that comes before the dusk. You've worked in the fields all day, or perhaps tended to the hearth, and now, as the heat begins to fade from the earth, the air cools ever so slightly. A subtle breeze stirs the trees, brushing against your skin, and it feels like the world is exhaling. There's no hurry to anything now. The village is quiet, with only the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional soft call of a bird overhead to break the silence. It's in moments like this that the true sense of peace in the village can be felt, an unspoken understanding that the pace of life here is slow, measured, and steady. Each day is much like the one before, yet there's a softness to the rhythms that allows you to settle into them with a kind of comfort. There's no need to rush through the hours seem content to pass without haste. In the distance, the low murmur of the stream can just barely be heard. Its trickle seems to match the cadence of your thoughts, flowing steadily without interruption. It's easy to forget about such things, the quiet, natural rhythms of the world that surround you, until the moment comes when you are reminded again. The cool water running over the stones, the slow glide of the river itself, these are the things that persist. These are the steady forces that have always been here, before the first stone was laid in the village, and long after the last will have passed. As the afternoon stretches on, there's a shift in the air. It's not the cold bite of evening yet, but something about the way the light falls now gives a sense of quiet anticipation. The sun has begun its slow descent toward the horizon, casting a warm golden hue over the earth, painting everything in its light like an old memory. The fields, once so bright in the midday sun, now seem to darken, becoming more muted in their colors, the edges of things softening as the shadows stretch long. It's the time of day when the work is done, when the chores are finished, and the hours seem to slow. The village, for the most part, is empty of activity now. Some have gone to their homes, ready to rest before the evening meal. Others sit quietly in the shade, enjoying the coolness that now settles around them like a gentle embrace. You might find yourself sitting by the hearth, or just outside your door, watching the slow shift of light. The air smells different now, damp from the day's warmth, earthy with the scent of growing things, and faintly sweet from the last of the flowers blooming in the late season. There's an almost magical quality to the air, as if the village itself is holding its breath, waiting for the evening to come. And yet, in its stillness there is no sense of urgency. Everything unfolds as it should, at its own pace, with no need for force. There's comfort in the predictability of it all, the slow quiet that wraps around you, the sun dipping ever so gently toward the horizon, the air growing cooler and more fragrant as the day eases into night. It's a rhythm that doesn't ask for anything. It simply is, and in that simplicity, there's peace. The day will pass into evening, and the shadows will creep into every corner. The last light will fade from the sky, and the stars will take their place, those quiet, constant companions who watch over the world. But for now, in this hollow of the afternoon, the world seems to take a moment to exhale, to pause in the space between. And as the hours stretch on, as the village quiets further, you will find yourself still here, part of this rhythm, part of this world. There's no need to move fast, no need to rush through time. In this moment, everything feels just as it should be, peaceful, slow, and steady. Morning in the quiet valley. The first light of dawn arrives without fanfare, as it always does. Not with a blaze of color or trumpet of sound, but with a soft shifting of light that gently nudges the darkness aside. It begins with a pale hue at the edge of the sky, barely noticeable at first, and then slowly deepens, stretching across the hills and creeping down into the valley where the village still sleeps. The stars dim one by one, fading not out of haste, but as if giving way to the coming day with quiet grace. Within the homes, all is still. The embers in the hearth have cooled during the long night, though a faint warmth lingers in the stones that lined the fire. It is a silence not of absence but of rest, a kind of hush that only comes after a night well slept, and before the demands of day begin. The village rests as if held in the palms of the hills themselves, and all things seem wrapped in the comfort of a world that asks nothing but stillness, for just a little longer. A single bird calls out from the trees, a cautious greeting to the morning, and then another joins in, and then another. Their song isn't loud, but it carries a light, curious chorus that lifts into the cool morning air. The breeze stirs, faint and playful, brushing gently through the tall grasses and nudging the dew-laced leaves. Every blade glistens with morning droplets, each reflecting the soft light in countless directions. The villagers begin to stir slowly, with no rush. There is no bell to toll, no clock to chime. Time flows here like a stream through a shaded glen, never still, but never in a hurry. A shutter creaks open. A wooden door swings quietly on its hinges. Feet pad gently across the packed earth floor as someone bends to stoke the hearth, coaxing orange embers back to life with breath and careful hands. There is a comfort in the ritual, no grand gestures, just small acts of care, of beginning again. Outside, smoke begins to rise from a few chimneys, curling upward into the morning air, twining with the mist that still lingers between the cottages and the hedgerows. The scent of wood smoke is earthy and familiar. It mingles with the sweet aroma of damp earth, and that particular green scent that only appears when the world is still wet with dew. The village doesn't awaken all at once, but rather unfolds itself gently, like petals opening toward the sun. You walk slowly through the quiet lanes between the cottages. The paths are worn smooth by generations of passing feet, by wooden carts, by barefoot children in summer. Chickens cluck softly in their pens. A pig stirs in its sty. Nothing is loud or sudden. The day simply grows warmer and more alive with each quiet breath. In the garden, rows of vegetables glisten with dew, their leaves gently trembling in the breeze. A bee, slow and drowsy, begins its lazy circuit around the flowering herbs. Everything is beginning, but nothing is rushed. That's the way of it here. There is a dignity in slowness, the sense that each thing deserves its time and its pace. A woman carries a pail of water from the well, her steps measured and familiar. The bucket creaks on its handle, the water inside sloshing gently with her movement. Across the way, a man tends to a fence, his hands moving carefully over the wooden rails, testing, tightening, tapping a peg back into place. They nod in greeting as they pass, not speaking, not needing to. Here the silence carries its own kind of language. The sun now sits just above the horizon, casting long shadows that reach out across the fields. The warmth has returned, though it is still gentle, just enough to lift the last of the mist from the grass and warm the stones beneath your feet. The sky above is soft and pale, streaked faintly with the remnants of the early morning light. You sit for a while on a small stone wall at the edge of the lane, watching as the village moves through its quiet morning. A pair of children run by, their laughter trailing behind them like ribbons in the air. An old dog trots after them, ears low, tongue hanging, content to follow wherever they might lead. Someone begins to hum a tune from inside a cottage, the melody soft and aimless, carried on the breeze. Everything around you seems to breathe in time with the earth. The trees sway, the birds call, the wind moves across the fields. Even the distant hills seem alive with a slow, unspoken rhythm. It's not the kind of place where time stands still, but the kind where time walks softly beside you, never pulling, never pushing. And as the morning deepens and the sun climbs higher, the village steps into the day with grace. The hours ahead will unfold as they always do, with chores and rest, with laughter and silence, with the comfort of small things done well. And all around, the world remains steady, its gentle rhythm guiding you forward, one quiet moment at a time. The path behind the mill. There's a narrow footpath, half covered in moss and nettle, that winds behind the old mill. Most don't walk it anymore. There's no destination at the end, no shrine or well or field worth the effort. But sometimes when you have a moment to yourself and nothing pressing in your hands, your feet take you there anyway. The stones beneath your soles shift gently with the years, no longer firm but not quite gone, just softened, as if even the land itself has forgotten why the path existed in the first place. The mill wheel creaks behind you, turning slow as ever, its rhythm the same as it's always been, maybe even older than the stones themselves. You keep walking, past the thicket where the wild currants grow, past the black stump that marks the storm from 3 winters ago. There's something quietly magnetic about this place, something that calls not with words, but with silence. Just the steady hush of wind through branches, the occasional flutter of a bird taking flight, the low breath of the earth exhaling between roots. You remember a time when children would dare each other to go this far, to follow the path to the place where the trees grow too thick to see the sky. They said strange lights could be seen there on certain nights. They whispered about a hermit who lived off roots and listened to stones speak, but that was all long ago. Those stories have worn thin, like cloth passed down too many times. Even the children now are quieter, their games are simpler, and you've stopped looking for stories in the dark. Still, your feet know the way. Each bend in the trail is familiar, like the lines on an old friend's face, the kind you don't need to ask anything of. Just being nearby is enough. You pass a grove of ash trees, tall and narrow, their bark flaking in thin silver ribbons. A raven calls once, sharp and distant. You pause and glance up, half expecting to see someone watching, but no one is there, just branches layered against one another, swaying with no sense of urgency. Further on you come to the stream. It's little more than a trickle this time of year, winding through a hollowed-out dip in the land like it's forgotten how to roar. You kneel beside it, dipping your fingers into the cool water, tracing the path it takes through pebbles smoothed by generations. Once someone built a small bridge here, nothing more than a few planks laid across stones. It's long gone now, only the stones remain, patiently remembering where the weight used to rest. On the far side, the forest thickens. The sun falls in softer slants here, dappled through layers of green and gold. You notice mushrooms growing along the roots, small and pale, thriving in shadow. No one planted them, they simply appeared, like everything else here, on their own quiet terms. You walk slowly now, each step taken more for the sake of the journey than the destination. There's no need to rush, nothing ahead is waiting that isn't already here. Even the wind seems to slow, whispering across your skin like a memory you haven't yet recalled. Eventually the path becomes less certain, less of a trail, more of a suggestion. Leaves cover everything. Your feet still know where to go, past the bent tree that always seemed to bow in greeting, past the fallen log where someone once carved a name no longer legible. Time here doesn't erase, it softens, makes sharp edges gentle. There's a clearing just ahead, not large, but quiet in a way that feels deliberate, as if the trees have stepped back slightly to make room. You sit down in the middle, on grass thick with the scent of crushed green. You can hear the mill faintly in the distance, a low, slow groan of wood and water, and you stay there for a while, not because you have to, but because it feels like a place that expects nothing, a corner of the world content to exist without purpose, just trees and sky, and the echo of a forgotten path. When you finally rise, brushing the earth from your palms, you don't look back. The way will still be there next time, and the mill will still be turning. Under the eaves of the south field, the path to the south field wound gently between two thickets, where low hazel branches bowed and tangled, like quiet witnesses to many seasons. It was not a main road, not even a cart trail, but rather a foot-worn way that the villagers had shaped slowly, year after year, with careful steps and wicker baskets carried on shoulders. Some called it the drover's lane, though no drover had passed that way in anyone's memory. Others simply called it the way to the south. By the time the sun reached its height and the shadows gathered tightly under the hedgerows, the lane became a place of muffled sounds and soft glances. Bees labored among the cow parsley and creeping comfrey, and a pair of jackdaws perched above on the crooked arm of a hawthorn, their eyes bright, watching. The south field lay low, pressed gently into the slope of the land like a folded sheet, caught between the forest fringe and the reach of the stream. In spring it held barley, in autumn it was often left to rest, but in the high days of summer, it became a different sort of place, not one of toil, but of waiting. It was here, under the eaves of that field, where a shallow bank met a clutch of old alders, that the villagers would sometimes retreat, not for work, but for shade and the small moments that life allowed between labours. There was no bench nor shelter, but a slight hollow in the earth, soft with grass and cool underfoot. Someone had placed a few flat stones there long ago, their surface smooth with time and the press of resting hands. This was where Wren often sat, her apron dusted with chaff, a bundle of herbs tied loosely at her side. She was not old, but her hands had the look of one who had drawn water, stacked peat, and husked grain for longer than her years might suggest. Wren liked the quiet that came at the edge of a field, not the silence of stillness, but the hush that follows effort, the breathing of land and folk together. When both had done their part for the day, she would watch the wind trace lines across the barley heads, like fingers brushing old cloth. She would listen to the insects ticking gently through the underbrush, to the soft rustle of the trees and the far-off crack of a wood pigeon's call. It was not a place of stories told aloud, but one of remembered words and imagined things. Children sometimes came to play at the edge of that field. They would fashion whistles from willow bark, or hide behind the trunks of the elder trees, pretending to be foxes or marsh sprites. One had once claimed to see a white deer slip through the shadows beyond the stream. Another said he found a coin in the roots of the alder, worn smooth and bearing no mark. Whether those tales were true or not didn't matter much. The south field allowed for such things. When the sun dipped low, the villagers would return along that same winding lane, their faces pink with the day's warmth, and their thoughts already drifting toward bread and broth. But often someone would pause just a moment longer, look back at the field, and the little bank beneath the trees. There was a sense, even if unspoken, that this place was quietly watching over them. One late summer evening, when the air was thick with the scent of fennel and warm earth, an old man named Hob brought a stool out to the edge of the field. He had walked with a limp since the snows of 10 winters past, and no longer sowed nor reaped, but he still rose with the sun, and liked to be near the workings of the world. He sat beneath the alder, and smoked his pipe, carving little shapes into softwood with a worn blade. That night he made a heron, thin and long, with a crooked neck and a clever eye. He left it there, tucked among the roots. The next day, it was gone. Some said the children had taken it, others said the heron had taken flight of its own will. Either way, a new one appeared some weeks later, this time, a hare crouched and ready. There was a gentle magic to the south field, but it was not one of spells or charms. It was the kind that came with the steady meeting of people and place, of familiar rhythms that shaped both body and land, the path worn not only by feet but by memory. And so it was that on some days when the sky was clear and the breeze light, you could find someone sitting under the eaves of the field, near the alder trees. They would sit in the stillness, alone but not lonely, their hands resting quietly in their lap, their eyes half closed, as though listening for something not quite heard. Not all fields are alike. Some are ploughed, some left fallow, some grow things seen, and some, like the one to the south, grow things softly, things like rest, recollection, and the sort of peace that lingers long after the footsteps have gone. The bell on the windbeam. The oldest barn in the village stood slightly apart from the others, its timbers silvered by time, and its roof bowed with years of snow and sun. No one remembered who built it. Not clearly, there were names whispered in the long dark of winter, tales of hands now gone, but none fixed. It had simply been there, as far as most could say, as much a part of the land as the beech hedge and the crooked track. What set it apart wasn't just its age, or the way its thatch held on despite the storms, but the little bell that hung on its windbeam, just above the western doors, tucked into the angle where the timber crossed. There it was, small, iron and rusted, with a pull-string made of plaited flax. It never rang loudly, never startled, but now and then, just as the wind changed, it would chime once, soft as a breath, as though the barn itself were exhaling. The bell wasn't a warning bell, nor a call to arms, or feast, or fire. It didn't mark hours, or seasons, or births. It simply rang, when it chose, sometimes in the full warmth of a summer afternoon, sometimes just before rain, sometimes in the deep hush before dawn. Some villagers said it was a weather bell, put there by a mason from the lowlands, who knew the old ways of wind. Others thought it was for luck, that the sound of it was meant to stir the spirits in the beams and wake them gently before harvest. Children, of course, had their own ideas. They said it rang when someone told a lie, or when a fox crossed the boundary of the field. One child even swore it only rang when no one was looking. Elda, the Hayward's wife, had the keys to the barn. She kept them on a braided cord, tucked beneath her apron. Each morning, before the dew dried from the grasses, she would unlock the side hatch and swing it wide, letting in the day. The birds always stirred then, the wrens from the eaves, the sparrows from the thatch. Sometimes she'd talk to the barn, half joking, half not. "Well, if you're listening," she'd mutter, as she checked the grain sacks and the racks of tools. "Then keep an eye on the oats. They're swelling faster than they ought." The barn smelled of dry straw, pine pitch, and the soft dust of seasons past. There were lines etched into its walls, marks to measure height and yield, tally strokes of lambs born, strange symbols whose meaning had long since slipped from memory. On still days, when nothing needed doing, the children would gather near the edge of the yard, watching the bell, daring each other to blink first, hoping, just hoping, to catch it in the act. But it never rang then, not when watched. Then came a morning in late autumn, when the frost had turned the grass stiff and brittle, and the sky was low with drifting mist. A stranger arrived, a bent man, wrapped in wool, and bearing a basket of dye roots. He said little, slept in the lean-to by the forge, but the next morning, the bell rang twice before sunrise. No wind, no storm, just 2 soft notes in the grey quiet. The stranger left the following day, and no one saw him again. But in his place, tucked behind the barrel of lard in the barn's corner, someone found a carved token, a small circle of ash wood, smooth on one side, and on the other, marked with a spiral and a single copper nail, pressed through the center. After that, the bell rang more often, never loud, never on cue, but always just before something small and curious happened. The arrival of a rook with a white feather, the discovery of a perfectly round egg, a fox that paused at the edge of the yard, and looked in, unafraid. The villagers stopped trying to explain it. they simply accepted it. The bell belonged to the barn, and the barn belonged to the village. And so it was with all things. One winter night, during the longest dark, the wind howled from the east, slates rattled on the mill roof, ashes blew from the forge, but the barn stood still, unmoved. And when dawn came, pale and hollow, the bell gave one long chime, clear and slow, like the final note of a lullaby. It became tradition, after that, to listen for the bell when one felt unsure. If it rang in the evening, it was said to be a sign of favor. If it rang at dawn, someone nearby had made a true decision. And if it rang in the quiet of midday, well, that meant nothing at all, or everything, depending on who you asked. No one dared remove it. When the wind beam cracked one spring and needed mending, the bell was carefully unhooked, wrapped in soft cloth, and placed by the hearth, until the beam was sound. Elder herself hung it back, whispering something no one else heard. Now and then, a visitor would hear the bell, and ask its purpose. It doesn't mean anything, the villagers would say with a shrug. It just rings when it pleases. But those who had grown old under its sound, who had stacked barley and chaff beneath that roof, knew better. The bell was not a thing of reason. It was a reminder that something watched gently over the wood, and the stone and the grain, and that time, like the wind, moved softly through the places we love. And when the bell rang, high above the door, they would pause, not long, just a heartbeat, and let its note carry quietly into the day. The woman who spoke to bread. There was a cottage at the far edge of the village, past the old flax plots, and the mossy stone where the sheep liked to scratch their sides. It leaned slightly to one side, as though listening carefully to the wind, and its chimney was always puffing a quiet trail of smoke that smelled faintly of oak ash, and something sweeter, perhaps honey, or cloves, or the crust of a loaf, just finished. The woman who lived there was called Miriam, though some still called her Mistress Crust in the old way, half out of jest and half out of quiet reverence. She was neither tall nor short, young nor old, and no one quite knew where she'd come from. What they did know, with absolute certainty, was that she could coax bread from flour the way others might call a bird to hand. Her loaves were different, not simply softer or warmer though they were, but deeper, more thoughtful, as if each held some piece of the morning sky or the memory of a long summer. Villagers said her rye bread could stop a quarrel, that her barley cakes eased births, and once in a particularly harsh frost, a flat round of hers kept a sick child sleeping through the night, when no other remedy would. Miriam spoke to her bread. It wasn't loud, not chanting or muttering, but soft things, whispers under her breath, murmured between shaping and folding. She'd lean close to the dough, her sleeves pushed up, her palms flour white, and say things like, "There now, that's better," or "a little longer, and we'll both be ready." She spoke to it like a friend. When asked, she'd simply smile and say, "You must give it words, or it'll never give you soul." And that was that. Her cottage was warm and low, with bundles of drying herbs hanging from the rafters and a carved ladle by every window. The hearth was broad and blackened, its stones worn smooth by years of kneading and turning. An old cat, striped like barley husk, dozed on the ledge beside the oven, its ear twitching at every shift in the fire. The villagers brought her flour, not bought, but milled by hand or gifted after threshing. In return, Miriam gave loaves, no coin exchanged, just bread for grain, and always a kind word. She remembered names, she remembered birthdays, and she always gave each child their own roll, shaped like a twist or a bird, warm enough to steam in mittened hands. It was said that she never burned a crust, never underbaked a crumb, that even in storms her oven held steady heat. That once, a fox entered her cottage, drawn by the scent, and left again without stealing a thing, just sat in the doorway, nose up, eyes soft, and then vanished back into the brush. One day, in the quiet weeks before planting, a traveling man came to the village. He wore fine boots and spoke too quickly, said he was seeking recipes, rare ones, and carried a book with pages made of vellum and a quill with a silver tip. He asked Miriam for her secrets. Asked to watch, asked to taste. She gave him a crust end from a day-old loaf, and nothing more. When he pressed, she said only, "Bread listens. It knows who's speaking." He left that evening, muttering about wasted time, and the next day, the bread he had packed in his bag was found flattened and sour, as if it had given up on being food altogether. Still, Miriam never bragged. She simply returned to her kneading. Each day the dough rose, and the air filled again with that old quiet scent of warmth and care. She passed on no apprentices, taught no formal lessons. But if you sat long enough near her hearth, If you watched with open eyes, you might notice how she pressed the edges just so, or hummed a tune under her breath that matched the rhythm of her kneading. One spring, when she fell ill and couldn't bake for 3 weeks, the village changed. The air felt thin, the mornings colder. Children lingered at the cottage gate, uncertain, and meals ended more quietly, without that final note of crust and warmth. When she returned, pale but smiling, the bells were rung, not the church bells, but the handbell from the mill, and the pan bell from the shepherd's post. And when she baked again, that first batch was shared out freely. No trade, no gift, just given, as bread ought to be. There are those who say Miriam knew things, old things, passed down through flour and hand and heat. That she learned not from books, but from the dough itself, that when the oven door closed, the village exhaled, and when it opened again, something more than bread was made. Even now, when others bake, they sometimes whisper over the dough without realizing. They speak kindly, gently, offering comfort, or thanks, or small bits of song. And though they may not say her name, they remember the woman who spoke to bread, not as a spell, but as a grace. Because in the end, bread remembers, it holds more than grain, it holds the shape of our days. The singing of the wind. The wind had a voice in those parts, though few noticed it, unless they were still long enough to listen. It didn't shout like the gales that tore through the moors, nor whisper like the breeze through the reeds. No, this wind had a soft voice, steady and clear, as though it had something to say and wanted to make sure it was heard. It didn't carry the scent of faraway lands or the sharp edge of winter. Instead, it smelled of earth, rich, damp earth, warmed by the sun, mixed with the faint fragrance of new growth. It moved between the trees and over the fields, curling through the thatch of the cottages, rustling the leaves in a way that seemed almost deliberate. The elders in the village, the ones who had lived long enough to know the changes in the seasons, said that this was the wind of memory. It was a wind that remembered the days before, when the land was wild and untamed, and the people only knew the rhythm of the earth. It wasn't a wind of change, but a wind of continuity, a reminder that everything was part of something older, something more enduring. No one paid it much mind, except for the children who played in the fields, their ears attuned to the soft hum of the wind as it danced around them. They would stand still for hours, eyes closed, listening to the sound of the wind as it moved through the grasses, the trees, the stone walls. Some said it sounded like a song without words, but full of meaning. Others said it was the voices of their ancestors, calling from the distant past, telling them things only the wind could know. It wasn't a song that could be heard in the usual way. It didn't have a melody or words, but it was still a song. It was a hum, a sigh, a whisper of sound that carried with it the weight of years and stories untold. The villagers, too, grew accustomed to it. It became a part of their daily lives, like the rising of the sun or the falling of the rain. When the wind began its song, they would pause for a moment, letting it fill the space around them, before continuing with their work. It didn't interrupt, didn't demand attention, it simply was. On the quietest mornings, when the dew still clung to the grass and the air felt thick with the promise of rain, the song of the wind seemed to stretch longer, as if it had more to say. It was then that you might catch a glimpse of something more, something just beyond the reach of the ordinary world, a shadow at the edge of your vision, or a thought that came and went without explanation. No one could explain it, and no one tried. It was enough to know that it was there, that the wind carried something more than just air, something that could not be named. And in the stillness of those moments, when the wind sang its song and the world held its breath, there was a sense of peace, as though the very earth itself was content, as though all was as it should be. It was on one such morning that Ella, the village weaver's daughter, walked alone across the fields, her feet light on the dewy grass. She was young, not yet 16, and her hair was still that pale gold of childhood, though it was beginning to darken with the first traces of womanhood. She had always been sensitive to the wind, more so than others. She would stand at the edge of the fields, eyes closed, listening, her hands resting on the wild flowers, waiting for the moment when the song of the wind would fill her heart. That morning, as she walked alone, the wind seemed particularly insistent, as if it were calling her, beckoning her forward. She paused, her breath steady, and closed her eyes, letting the wind carry its song to her ears, and for the first time she heard it, clearly, unmistakably, a soft voice, barely audible, but there all the same, calling her name. It was not the wind, not the trees or the grasses, it was something else, something old, something deep, hidden in the very fabric of the land. It whispered her name, over and over, a gentle call, like the pull of the tide. And then, as soon as she heard it, it was gone. She stood there for a long moment, the breeze brushing her skin, unsure of what had just happened. She looked around, expecting to see someone behind her, but there was no one. The fields stretched wide and empty before her, the only sound the soft hum of the wind. Still, the feeling lingered. The wind had spoken, and in its voice, she had heard something ancient and true. She didn't understand it, not fully, but she knew it was a message, one that could not be ignored. From that day on, Ella listened more closely to the wind. She began to feel it more keenly, as though it had become a part of her, guiding her through the days. And sometimes, when she was working in the loom room, or walking the long way home, she would hear that same soft whisper again, calling her name, urging her forward. The village folk noticed a change in her. She became more serene, more attuned to the rhythms of the land, as if the wind had woven its song into her very being. She would smile softly to herself, as though she carried a secret only she could understand. And in time, others came to notice the wind's song more too, not just as a sound in the air, but as something more, something that spoke to them in quiet ways. And though no one ever truly understood what it was that the wind was saying, they knew that it was a part of the land, something woven into the very fabric of the world, a song of the earth itself. And when they heard it, they paused, just for a moment, to listen. The keeper of the waters? There was a pond on the edge of the village, a still and quiet place where the reeds grew thick, and the water was clear, but only if you looked close enough to see past the surface. It wasn't a pond that anyone spoke of, often, for there was no need. It simply was, tucked away in a hollow of the land, a quiet companion to the seasons, unchanged and patient, year after year. The village folk came to the pond in their own time, for water, for a moment of peace, for the quiet understanding that came from standing near its stillness. The children played along its banks, chasing dragonflies and skipping stones. The women filled their pitchers with the water that ran slow from its dark depths. The men came to fish when the days were long, and the sun was heavy on the earth. But it was the old man Eorel who was known to be the keeper of the waters, though no one ever quite knew when he had begun that quiet role, or how long he had tended to the pond. He was as much a part of it as the reeds themselves, his weathered skin like the bark of the trees that lined its shores, his hands rough as stones from years of working the land. Eorel had no house to speak of, but rather a small shelter, tucked beneath the willows that wept their branches into the water. It was little more than a roof of thatch, and a few walls of wattle, but it was enough. Inside there was always the smell of damp earth and wood, a scent that clung to the very air. He never spoke of why he came to the pond, why he had chosen to stay by its waters. It was simply known that he had a gift for knowing its moods. He could sense when the water was too high or too low, when the currents beneath the surface shifted, when the fish swam in a different direction. There were times when he would walk down to the water's edge, his long, slow steps making little sound, and simply stand there, watching, listening, his eyes fixed on the still water, as if it were speaking to him. There were whispers, of course. The villagers talked in the quiet of evening, when the last light of the day faded behind the hills. They said that Eorel had once been a fisherman, long ago, but had given up his trade when he learned the true language of the water. They said he had lived many lifetimes, that his eyes held the stories of every rainstorm and every drought the pond had ever known. Some said he could even speak to the fish, that he knew when they were ill or hungry, or when the time had come for them to leave. No one knew for sure. Eorel never spoke of such things, nor did he ask anyone else for help. He simply was there, watching over the pond, content in his role, as if it were his to care for, his to protect, and his to know. The pond itself was no stranger to change. There were seasons of plenty, when the water swelled after the rains and the reeds grew tall, their tips brushing the sky, and there were seasons of quiet, when the surface was calm and still, when the air hung heavy with the scent of earth and water. The fish that swam in its depths were never the same, though they always returned to the same places year after year, their silver scales flashing in the sun. One spring, the waters grew low, and the reeds began to dry out at their bases. The villagers, concerned, came to Eorel for help. They asked if there had been a change in the land, if the pond was sick, or if it was dying. Eorel simply nodded and went to the water's edge, as he had done many times before, his fingers brushing the surface. For several days, he walked the shores of the pond, stopping at different points, his eyes scanning the water, his hands resting on the earth. Then, one evening, he went into the village and asked for a single loaf of bread and a pitcher of milk. When he returned to the pond, he walked to the center, stood for a long while, and then with a steady hand, placed the loaf and the milk into the water. The villagers watched, puzzled, from the edge of the field, and some muttered among themselves. "He's lost his wits," one said. "Bread and milk to the waters, what good will that do?" But Eorl said nothing. He simply stood there, watching, waiting, as the bread sank beneath the surface, and the milk spread like a soft cloud. The water stirred slightly, rippling, as if something had taken it in. And the next morning, when the villagers came to fetch their water, they saw that the pond was full again, the reeds green and tall, and the fish swimming freely, as they had done before. After that, no one questioned Eorl's ways. They didn't need to. They had seen for themselves that he knew something about the waters that they did not. Years passed, and though Eorl grew older, slower in his steps, his presence by the pond never wavered. The village continued, with births and deaths, harvests and winters, but the pond remained constant, a part of the land, and the rhythm of the earth. And though no one spoke of it, they knew that Eorl, the keeper of the waters, was its heart. It was said that when the last fish left the pond, Eorl would go with it, following it to the deepest, darkest place in the world, where the waters were pure and endless. But that time had not yet come. For now he remained, watching over the stillness, listening to the quiet song of the water, and knowing that as long as the pond held its peace, so too would the village. The firelights flicker. As the days grew shorter, the shadows of the evening stretched longer across the land, and the crackling firelight became a constant companion in the homes of the village. The hearths, always warm with the scent of wood smoke, held a quiet magic in their glow, flickering with the rhythms of the past and the future alike. It was in the flicker of the flames that the villagers found solace, a gentle reminder that even as the world outside grew cold and dark, there was light here within their walls, and warmth, and stories. The fire was never a mere tool for cooking or heat. No, it was more than that. It was a living thing, a constant presence in the home. In the small cottages where the beams of wood crossed the low ceilings and the thatch walls absorbed the quiet sounds of life, the fire danced in the corner, its flames reaching upward, twisting and curling with a life of their own. The hearth itself was sacred, not in the sense of religion or ceremony, but in the sense that it was a place of gathering. Here families came together at the end of their days, pulling their chairs close to the warmth, resting their tired limbs after a day spent working the fields or tending the animals. The crackling fire provided a rhythm to the evening, its sounds and sights lulling the weary into a state of calm. Old Rena, the village elder, often sat closest to the fire, her hands twisted with age, knitting quietly as the flames flickered before her. She had lived long enough to see many fires burn, many seasons pass, and she knew that in the dancing light there was something timeless, something that reached back beyond the years, beyond the village, beyond the land itself. Her eyes, though dim with age, were sharp when it came to the fire. She could tell if the wood was dry or damp, if the flames would rise high or burn low, and there were nights when she would sit and watch the fire long after the others had fallen to sleep, as if waiting for something to speak, something to emerge from the glow. It was on such a night, when the wind howled outside and the moon hung low in the sky, that Rena finally spoke of it. Her voice, soft and low, barely more than a murmur against the hiss of the flames, was heard only by those who were close enough to listen. "Long ago," she began, her voice steady despite the years, "there was a time when the fire was more than just warmth. It was a messenger, a guide, and those who knew how to listen could hear its call, could follow its light to places the eyes could not see." The others in the room looked up from their tasks, some of them pausing in their work, others simply watching her with quiet curiosity. It wasn't unusual for Rena to speak in such riddles, but on this night, there was something different in the way she spoke, something that made the air feel heavier, as if the fire itself was listening, waiting. "Do you hear it?" she asked softly, almost to herself. "The way the flames flicker and dance. There is a language there, if you know how to listen. It speaks of the past, of things forgotten, of the things we have lost, and the things we will one day find." The fire crackled as if in response, sending up a small shower of sparks into the cool night air. Rena's eyes glinted in the firelight, and she smiled, though the smile was tinged with something wistful, something that spoke of both wisdom and sorrow. "For years," she continued, "I have sat by this fire, watching the flames, listening to the wind. And there are times when I have heard voices, soft and faint, like whispers from far away. Not voices of men, nor of creatures, but voices of the land itself, speaking through the fire. The fire remembers, you see. It remembers everything that has ever been, and when you listen, truly listen, it will show you the way. The younger ones in the room exchanged looks, some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned in closer, eager for the tale to unfold. There was something about Rena's voice, something in the way she spoke, that made them want to believe her. Long ago, she murmured, there were people who knew how to speak with the fire. They would sit by the hearth, alone or in groups, and they would listen. The fire would tell them where to go, what to do, and sometimes, it would even show them glimpses of the future. The room grew quiet, the only sound the occasional crack of the fire, the occasional stir of the wind outside. Rena's words hung in the air, like the smoke that rose from the embers, thick and swirling, impossible to catch. I was young once, she said, her voice growing softer still, and I remember sitting by the fire, listening, waiting for the flame to speak, and sometimes, it would tell me things I couldn't understand at first, but later, I would see the truth of it. The fire does not lie. The flames crackled again, casting long shadows across the room, stretching the figures of the villagers, until they seemed to grow larger, taller than they were. The fire was alive, it seemed to say, alive with stories, alive with memories, and alive with the promise of something beyond. When the night had grown deep, and the fire had burned low, Rena fell silent, her hands still in her lap, her eyes fixed on the embers. The others in the room sat quietly, as if waiting for the fire to speak again, but it did not. Instead, the night stretched on, the flickering light casting soft patterns across the walls, filling the space with its quiet song. And in the stillness of that night, the villagers knew that the fire, though it may be simple in its form, was more than just a flame. It was a keeper of stories, a holder of secrets, a guide through the darkness. And as long as it burned, it would continue to tell its tales, to flicker and dance, waiting for those who would listen. The fallow field. In the heart of the village, beyond the stone walls and the thatched roofs, lay a field that no one tended, a stretch of earth left to rest. It was called the fallow field, and it was a place of quiet reflection, a space that belonged to neither the past nor the future, but to the present, to the moment of stillness that the land required. The fallow field had once been part of a thriving farm, its soil rich and fertile, yielding crops year after year, but time, as it does, had shifted the rhythms of life, and the land had fallen silent. The work that had once been done there, planting, harvesting, tending, was no longer needed. The village had changed, the people had changed, and with them, the way the land was cared for. Now, the field lay untouched, its tall grasses swaying in the breeze, its earth deep and quiet, waiting for the time when it would once again be called upon to give. At first glance, the fallow field might have seemed neglected, perhaps even abandoned, but there was a beauty in its neglect. The soil was rich with the remains of past seasons, the nutrients and stories of plants long gone, waiting for the new to grow. And in the quiet of its rest, the field held a special kind of peace, a peace that only the earth could know. The villagers often spoke of the fallow field in hushed tones, not with the judgment they might give to a neglected house or an untended garden, but with a kind of reverence. They knew that the land had its own way, its own pace. It would not be hurried, and it would not be forced. It would take the time it needed, and when it was ready, it would give again. Each season, the villagers would walk past the fallow field on their way to the market, or the mill, their footsteps quiet on the worn path that curved along its edge. The field would be different every time they passed it, sometimes golden, with the late summer sun, sometimes dark and rich after the autumn rains. And though they rarely stopped, rarely paused to admire its stillness, they knew it was there, a constant presence in the background of their lives. The children of the village, however, saw the fallow field differently. To them, it was a place of mystery, a space that seemed to hold secrets just beyond reach. They would often run past it, their laughter echoing in the air, chasing the wind through the tall grasses, daring each other to cross the boundary that separated the field from the rest of the world. And sometimes, on quiet afternoons, when the air was still and the sun hung low in the sky, a few of the older children would slip into the field, just to see what they might find. They would run barefoot across the soft earth, feeling the coolness of the soil between their toes, the weight of the past pressing down upon them, as if the field itself were watching, waiting. They would lie on their backs and look up at the sky, feeling the warmth of the sun on their skin, their bodies growing heavy with the weight of time. For a moment the world seemed to stop. The hum of the village, the noise of life, faded away, leaving only the sound of their breath, the rustling of the grass, and the quiet rhythm of the land. The fallow field held them in its embrace, its stillness wrapping around them like a blanket. as if it were telling them that in this moment, they were part of something much larger, much older than themselves. There were whispers that the field held memories, that the land itself remembered everything that had been done upon it. Some said it was a place where the ancestors walked, where their footsteps could still be felt beneath the surface, where their voices could still be heard in the rustling of the grass. Others claimed that the field was blessed, that the earth itself had a soul, a quiet, gentle soul, that watched over the village and kept it safe. But no one really knew. No one could say for sure what the fallow field was, or what it had been. All they knew was that it was there, a part of the land, a part of the village's past, and a part of its future. It was a reminder that life, like the earth, needed rest, needed space to breathe and grow. And so, the field remained undisturbed, its soil waiting for the time when it would be needed once again. As the years passed, the field became a place of quiet refuge. The older villagers, those who had seen the turning of many seasons, would often sit at its edge, resting for a moment before continuing their work. They would close their eyes and let the soft breeze wash over them, listening to the whisper of the grass, the hum of the earth beneath. In those moments, they felt a connection to something ancient, something beyond the everyday. It was as if the field was not merely a patch of land, but a living part of the world, a quiet keeper of the village's history. And so, life went on around the fallow field. The children grew, the seasons turned, and the village continued its work, its rhythm, its quiet dance with the land. The fallow field, with its resting soil and its patient grasses, remained a constant, a symbol of the quiet moments of life, the moments when time slowed, when the earth held its breath, and when all was still. No one knew when the time would come for the field to awaken. But when it did, when the land was ready to give once more, it would do so with a quiet grace, as it always had. And the villagers would be there, waiting, ready to honor the land, ready to tend it once again. For now, though, the field rested, and in its rest, there was peace, a peace that stretched across the land, a peace that would last as long as the village itself, a peace that would never fade. The wind in the hollow. The village lay nestled in the valley, its quiet lanes and thatched cottages hidden beneath the watchful gaze of the hills that rose in the distance. In the midst of this peaceful world, there was a place known to the villagers as the Hollow. It was a small, sheltered glen, tucked away between two gentle hills, where the wind always seemed to find its voice. The Hollow was not marked on any map, nor was it a place anyone particularly sought out. It was simply there, existing on the edges of the land, like a forgotten note in a familiar song. It was a place that felt apart from the rest of the world, as if it belonged to a different time, or perhaps to no time at all. The wind that came through the hollow was unlike the wind that blew across the open fields, or through the winding lanes of the village. It had a different quality, softer, almost whispering, as if it carried with it secrets that had been passed down through generations. The villagers, those who had lived their whole lives here, spoke of the hollow in the same hushed tones they reserved for things that were old and mysterious. Some believed the wind in the hollow was a messenger, a voice from the past that came to remind them of forgotten things. Others simply believed it was the way the wind worked when it found a place to rest, gathering itself in the dips of the hills before moving on. There were those who said the wind in the hollow was special because it carried a memory of the land itself. They said that if you stood in the center of the glen and closed your eyes, you could hear the whispers of the earth beneath your feet, the rustling of ancient trees, and the soft murmur of the river that ran unseen somewhere far beyond. The wind, they said, was a keeper of stories, and for those who listened, it would tell them tales of long ago. It was easy to understand why the villagers believed such things. The hollow was a place of solitude, a quiet sanctuary where the weight of the world seemed to fade away. The air there was thick with the scent of moss and earth, and the trees that grew in the glen stood tall and unmoving, their branches interwoven in a soft embrace, sheltering the space from the world outside. In the early mornings, when the mist still clung to the ground and the sky was pale with the first light of dawn, the hollow was a place of stillness, a place where time seemed to slow. The children, when they ventured near the hollow, would often pause at its edge, their faces upturned to the wind, listening intently as it passed through the trees. Sometimes, the wind would stir the leaves in such a way that it sounded almost like a voice, soft and low, calling them to listen. The older children would speak of it in whispered tones, as if the wind might overhear them and take offense. It was said that the wind could carry away words, and that if you spoke too loudly or too often of what you heard, the wind might forget its message and stop altogether. The hollow, like the wind that passed through it, was a place of quiet reflection. It was a spot where the villagers would go when they needed to gather their thoughts or find a moment of peace away from the busyness of life. It was not a place for work or for conversation, but for stillness, for quiet communion with the land. and in that stillness, the village's heartbeat could be felt in the soft rustle of the leaves, the gentle flow of the stream, and the steady sigh of the wind. One autumn evening, as the sun sank low behind the hills, and the air grew cooler with the promise of the coming night, old Bramwell, the village storyteller, made his way to the hollow. It was not often that he ventured so far from the hearth or the warmth of his home, but there was something in the wind that day, something that beckoned him, and he could not ignore it. The villagers had long known Bramwell as a man who had lived through many seasons, seen many changes, and gathered many stories. He was a keeper of the village's history, a man whose memory stretched back farther than most could imagine, and it was said that when he spoke, it was not just the words he shared, but the very way he spoke them that made them special. He had a way of weaving the past with the present, blending the known with the unknown, so that each story felt alive, breathing. As he stood at the edge of the hollow, Bramwell closed his eyes and listened. The wind stirred the leaves above him, a gentle sigh passing through the trees. It was not the first time he had come to the hollow, but this evening was different. The wind felt stronger, more insistent, as though it had something important to say. He took a deep breath, and then, as if in response, the wind seemed to grow quieter, settling into a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. Bramwell smiled, for he knew what it was. The wind in the hollow had a story to tell, and it had chosen him to hear it. He sat down on the soft earth, his back leaning against the trunk of an ancient oak tree. The wind, now softer and more deliberate, began to carry its tale. The story was not one of men or beasts, but of the land itself. It spoke of the days when the hills had been young, when the trees had first begun to stretch their branches toward the sky, when the stream had carved its path through the earth for the very first time. The wind, Bramwell understood, was the voice of the land's memory. It was a keeper of moments, a collector of the past, and though the villagers could not hear it as he did, they could feel it, in the rustling of the leaves, in the way the seasons turned, in the deep quiet of the hollow. The land was alive with stories, and the wind, though often silent, carried them all, waiting for someone to listen. As the evening deepened, and the stars began to emerge above the hills, Bramwell rose from the earth, his heart full of the stories that the wind had shared. He knew that the hollow was not just a place of stillness, but a place of memory, a place where the land whispered its past to those who were willing to listen. And so, with the wind still whispering in his ears, Bramwell made his way back to the village, where the firelight awaited him, and the villagers were ready for the stories that would carry them through the long quiet nights of winter. The stony path, beyond the village, past the last of the homes and the quiet garden plots. There was a path that led up into the hills, a narrow trail that wound its way between moss-covered stones and gnarled trees. This was the stony path, and though it was not long, it was a journey in itself. It was a path that held memories, a path worn smooth by the countless steps of those who had walked it before. The villagers knew the stony path well, though few travelled it often. It was not a road that led to any particular place, not a path that brought one to the market or to the mill. Instead, it was a path that meandered through the hills, curling through quiet glades, skirting the edges of quiet streams, and leading to places that felt removed from the rest of the world. The path had been there for as long as anyone could remember. It had been made, perhaps, by the feet of travellers long ago, or by the creatures of the forest who had found their way through the hills. Over time, the stones had settled into the earth, smoothing their sharp edges, and the trees had bent over the path, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that shielded the path from the sun. In the early mornings, when the mist hung low over the ground, the path seemed almost magical, as if it were waiting for something or someone to pass through. There were stories, too, about the stony path. Some said that it had been laid out by the ancestors, long before the village had been built. Others claimed that it was a sacred path, one that had been used by the old druids, or by wandering monks seeking solitude in the hills. Whatever its origin, the villagers treated the path with quiet respect, as one might treat a quiet old friend. It was there, always, winding its way through the hills, as constant and timeless as the land itself. On the rare occasions when someone ventured along the path, it was often for a purpose known only to them. Some said that it was a place of quiet reflection, a place where one could walk without interruption, without the noise of daily life. Others came to the stony path when they needed to find a moment of solitude, a moment to breathe and think. And there were those who said the path led to something deeper, something hidden in the hills, though none could say for certain what that might be. For the children of the village, the stony path was a place of wonder. They would often wander along its edges, their laughter echoing through the trees as they skipped over the stones and peered into the underbrush for signs of the small creatures that made their home there. They would run ahead, daring each other to go farther, to find the end of the path, though none had ever quite managed to do so. The path seemed to twist and turn, as if it were endless, and it was easy to lose oneself in its winding course. But for all its mystery, the stony path was not a dangerous place. It was a quiet road, a road that led nowhere in particular, but that held something more than just a destination. There was a calmness to the path, a gentle rhythm to the way it wound through the hills, that seemed to settle the mind. To walk it was to become part of the land itself, to feel the quiet pulse of the earth beneath your feet, to listen to the whisper of the wind through the trees and the soft murmur of the stream that ran alongside. As the seasons passed, the stony path changed with the land around it. In the spring, it was a place of renewal, the stones warmed by the sun, the ground soft with new growth. The trees that lined the path were heavy with the promise of blossoms, and the air smelled sweet with the scent of wild flowers. In the summer, the path was dappled with light, the canopy above filtering the sun into soft patterns on the ground. The air was thick with the hum of bees and the rustle of leaves, and the path felt cool and refreshing, even on the warmest days. In the autumn, the stony path transformed once again. The trees shed their leaves, leaving behind a blanket of gold and red on the ground. The air grew crisp, and the sound of footsteps on the path was muted by the softness of the fallen leaves. It was a time of quiet change, a time to reflect on the passing year, and the path seemed to echo with the memories of the seasons that had come before. And in the winter, the stony path was a place of stillness. The trees stood bare, their branches etched against the pale sky, and the ground was hard with frost. The wind, now sharper and colder, would stir the branches, making them creak and groan. The path itself would be blanketed in a thin layer of snow, softening the edges of the stones and muffling the sound of footsteps. It was a time when the world seemed to hold its breath, and the stony path became a place of quiet solitude, where one could walk in the hush of winter and feel the quiet peace of the earth beneath. Old Bramwell, the storyteller, had walked the stony path many times. He had passed along it in all seasons, in the light of day and the quiet of night, and each time, it had offered him something new. He often said that the path had a way of bringing him to the places he needed to be, even if he didn't know where that was. And there in the quiet spaces between the hills, he had found some of the stories that he would later tell by the fireside, stories of the land, of the village, and of the people who had walked the path before him. One evening, as the light of the day began to fade, Bramwell made his way along the stony path once again. He had no particular purpose, no destination in mind, but he felt the need to walk, to let the rhythm of the path carry him. The air was cool, the sky clear, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of earth and pine. It was a perfect evening for a walk, and as Bramwell walked, he felt the weight of the world around him lift, his mind clearing with each step. He didn't know what he would find, only that the path, as it always did, would take him where he needed to go. And so, with each step, the stony path seemed to stretch out before him, endless and comforting, a reminder that no matter where life might lead, there would always be a place to walk, always a path that would take him home. The lantern by the well. As the last light of the day faded beyond the hills, the village began to settle into its familiar rhythm of evening. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of daily life, laughter, chatter, the clinking of pots and pans softened, giving way to the quiet hush of night. In the center of the village, there was a well, its stone structure worn smooth by years of use, and beside it, a lantern hung on a simple wooden post. This lantern was a fixture of the village's evening hours, a beacon of warmth and light in the deepening darkness. It wasn't much to look at, just a simple iron frame with a glass globe that held a flickering flame, but to the villagers, it was something more. It was a signal, a small but constant presence that marked the passage of time from day to night. The well itself had been there for as long as anyone could remember, a source of water for the village, dug deep into the earth, where the water ran cool and clear. Around the well, a stone circle had been built, a low wall to keep the earth from crumbling away. The villagers would gather there each morning and evening, waiting their turn to draw water from the depths. And over time, the well had become a kind of meeting place. It was where news was shared, where stories were told, and where the rhythm of daily life was set. As evening came and the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, the villagers would go to the well to fetch their final buckets of water for the day. It was a quiet moment, one that marked the transition from the busyness of the day to the calm of the night. And there beside the well hung the lantern, casting a soft golden glow over the stones, its flame dancing gently in the cool evening breeze. The lantern was always lit at dusk, and though it was not a large or grand thing, it was enough to make the village feel safe, to make the night feel less uncertain. The flame within it flickered steadily, a reminder that even in the darkest of hours there was always light to be found. The lantern had been tended to for generations. Its light passed from one hand to the next, and there was something comforting in knowing that it would always be there. A small symbol of continuity in a world that often felt unpredictable. On the rare occasions when the wind blew particularly hard, and the lantern's flame flickered dangerously, the villagers would gather close, watching anxiously as the flame sputtered in the breeze. It was a moment of collective breath-holding, and more than once someone would rush forward to shield the lantern, ensuring that its light did not go out. It was said that if the lantern went dark, something would be lost. Some small part of the village's connection to its past, its bond to the land. But the villagers had learned to trust the lantern's light, knowing that it was never truly at risk of disappearing. The flame, like the village itself, would always find a way to endure. One evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of violet and the first stars began to appear, old Margaret, the village healer, made her way to the well. She had seen many sunsets in her time, had lived through many seasons of drought and rain, and had always found comfort in the rhythm of the village's daily life. As she walked, her steps slow and steady, she looked up at the lantern, its light glowing softly in the growing dark. There was something about it that made her feel connected to everything, to the earth beneath her feet, to the people she had known for so long, to the generations of villagers who had passed through this land before her. Margaret was not a woman given to idle thoughts or fanciful notions. She had always been practical, grounded in the here and now. But on this particular evening, as she paused beside the well watching the flame dance in the lantern, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. It was a peace born of years of living in harmony with the land, of understanding its cycles, its moods, its rhythms. The flame, the well, the village, these were her constant companions, the things that had been with her for all of her days, and in that moment, she felt a deep gratitude for their steady presence. She took her turn at the well, drawing a bucket of water with ease, her hands steady and sure. As she lifted the bucket from the depths, she couldn't help but smile at the thought of how many times she had done this in her life. It was a small task, an everyday chore, but it was one that connected her to the land, to the village, and to the people who relied on her. It was a quiet act of service, one that would continue long after she was gone. When Margaret had finished, she carried the bucket of water back toward her cottage, her mind quiet, her heart full. The lantern by the well, now casting long shadows on the ground, was still there, its flame flickering gently in the breeze. As she walked away, she cast one last glance at the well, at the lantern, at the soft glow that illuminated the village. There was something profoundly comforting in that light, in the steady flicker that spoke of endurance and time. It was as if the lantern were a silent guardian, watching over the village, marking the passage of each day with its steady flame. And so, as the village drifted deeper into the quiet of night, the lantern remained alight, a small but steadfast reminder that there was always light to be found, even in the darkest of times. It would burn until the first light of dawn, guiding the villagers through the hours of darkness and into the new day. The quiet grove, beyond the village, at the edge of the fields where the green of the crops began to soften into the wild undergrowth of the forest, there was a grove. It was a small, secluded place, tucked away from the busy paths that led to the market and the mill, a quiet sanctuary where the sounds of the world seemed to fade into the rustling leaves and soft murmurs of nature. The grove was not marked by any grand signs or stones, and most of the villagers passed by it without a second thought, yet those who knew it well understood its peace. The trees in the grove were old, their trunks thick and weathered, their branches high above, tangled in a lattice of leaves that filtered the sunlight into soft green patterns on the ground. The air there was always cool and fresh, even in the heat of summer, and the scent of moss and damp earth clung to everything. It was the kind of place that seemed to invite quiet reflection, where the bustle of life outside could be forgotten, if only for a moment. For many, the grove held a special kind of magic. It was not the magic of spells or charms, but the kind that comes from simply being in a place that feels timeless and untouched. There was something about the way the light filtered through the branches, the way the birds sang in the higher reaches of the trees, that made the grove feel sacred, as if it were a place where the very earth itself held secrets, secrets that were passed down through the generations, woven into the very fabric of the land. Margaret, the village healer, often visited the grove when she needed to gather her thoughts. The world of the village, with its busy rhythms and constant demands, could sometimes feel overwhelming, and the grove was a place where she could escape for a while, to sit and listen to the quiet and breathe in the peace of the earth. It was in the grove that she had learned the names of the herbs and plants that grew in the wild, where she had listened to the soft rustling of the leaves and learned the language of the wind. One day, as the sun began to sink lower in the sky, Margaret made her way to the grove, her feet familiar with the path that led there. The day had been warm, and the air was thick with the hum of bees and the distant call of birds. As she walked, her mind was quiet, her steps slow and purposeful. She had gathered all she needed from the village, and now she sought the comfort of the grove's shade. When she reached the entrance of the grove, she paused for a moment, taking in the stillness of the place. The world outside seemed distant here, as if it existed in another realm altogether. The breeze stirred the branches above her, and the soft murmur of the forest filled the air. It was a moment of deep peace, the kind of peace that made everything else seem far away. Margaret stepped into the grove, her feet sinking softly into the moss-covered ground. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the cool, earthy air. The grove was exactly as it always was, quiet, still, and unchanging. The tall trees loomed above, their leaves whispering in the wind, and the light that filtered through the canopy cast long dappled shadows on the ground. In the distance, a small stream gurgled gently, its waters slipping over the smooth stones and carrying with it the scent of fresh water and earth. As she walked deeper into the grove, Margaret found a small clearing where the grass grew thick and soft, the earth beneath it rich with the life of the forest. Here she often sat, her back resting against one of the ancient trees, her eyes closed as she let the quiet of the grove wash over her. It was a place where time seemed to slow, where the world outside lost its urgency, and where she could simply be. She sat down now, settling into the soft grass, and closed her eyes for a moment. The breeze caressed her skin, and she listened to the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects, and the occasional call of a bird in the distance. It was all so familiar, so comforting, like a lullaby that had been sung for generations. As Margaret sat there, she thought of the village, of the people she cared for, and of the work that awaited her. But in the grove, none of that seemed important. Here in this quiet sanctuary, there was only the moment, only the peaceful rhythm of nature that flowed around her. It was enough to simply be here, to let the world outside fade into the background. She stayed for a while, letting her thoughts drift, feeling the earth beneath her and the sky above her. The sun, now low on the horizon, cast a soft golden light through the trees, making the leaves glow like fire. The shadows grew long, and the air became cooler, but still the grove held its peace, as it always had. When Margaret finally stood to leave, she took one last look around the grove, a quiet smile playing on her lips. The grove would always be there, just as it had been for centuries, a quiet refuge from the busyness of life, a place to rest and remember what was truly important. She made her way back to the village, her heart lighter than when she had arrived. The grove had a way of doing that, reminding her that amidst the noise and bustle of life, there was always a place to find peace, to reconnect with the land, and to listen to the quiet voices that whispered through the trees. The hollow oak. There was an oak tree at the edge of the village, its mighty branches stretching wide like outstretched arms, offering shade to those who sought refuge beneath its canopy. It was a tree unlike any other, towering above the smaller trees around it, its trunk thick and gnarled, its bark rough and weathered by the years. But what made it special was not just its size, nor the way its leaves shimmered golden in the autumn light. It was the hollow within its trunk, a deep cavity worn smooth by the passage of time. The hollow oak had been there for as long as anyone could remember, standing quietly in its place as the seasons passed, its roots tangled deep in the earth, its branches reaching toward the sky. The villagers had long known about the hollow within the tree, and over the years it had become a small repository of forgotten things, a place where people left offerings or treasures, or sometimes simply left their worries. Some believed the hollow oak was magical. It was said that if you left a gift in the hollow, perhaps a stone you found while walking, or a small token from a loved one, you would find that your troubles eased, your heart lightened, and the winds of fortune would blow in your favor. But it wasn't the belief in magic that drew the villagers to the oak. No, it was something simpler than that. In the quiet of the evening, when the sun hung low in the sky, and the village settled into its nighttime rhythm, a few of the villagers would make their way to the oak, drawn by its quiet presence. Old folk and young alike would stand before it, contemplating their day, their lives, their joys, and their burdens. Some would rest their hands on the rough bark, feeling the pulse of the tree beneath their fingertips. Others would sit at its base, listening to the rustling of the leaves and the soft sighs of the wind as it moved through the branches. The hollow oak was a place of stillness, a place where time seemed to slow, where the weight of the world outside could be left behind, if only for a moment. And as the seasons passed, It became a symbol of the village's resilience, its quiet endurance. No matter what challenges the villagers faced, the oak remained steadfast, its branches always reaching toward the sky, its roots deeply anchored in the soil beneath. One evening, as the first stars began to blink in the sky, Margaret, the village healer, made her way to the hollow oak. The day had been long, filled with work and conversation, and though the village was now settling into quiet, she found herself seeking the solace of the oak's shade. She had been troubled by the weight of the world lately, as she always was when the seasons changed. There was a restlessness in her heart, a sense that something important was just beyond her reach, and she knew that only in the stillness of the grove or beneath the ancient trees would she find the peace she sought. As she approached the oak, its massive trunk rising before her, she paused for a moment to take in the sight of it. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting the oak's shadow long across the grass. The air was cool now, carrying the earthy scent of the land, the freshness of the evening dew. There was no rush in the way the night descended, no hurry to the way the village quieted. It was as if everything was in its rightful place, moving at the pace it was meant to. Margaret stepped closer to the tree, her hands resting lightly on its bark. She felt the roughness of it against her palms, the weight of the centuries it had withstood. The hollow, dark and quiet, beckoned to her, and without thinking, she knelt beside it. Inside the hollow, she could see remnants of other offerings, small bundles of dried herbs, stones smoothed by time, scraps of cloth tied in knots. Some of these offerings had been left there by others seeking peace, while others, like Margaret's own, had been placed as silent prayers to the unseen forces that moved through the world. She reached into the hollow, her fingers brushing the edges of a stone that had been left there by someone else. It was smooth, round, and carried the weight of time within it. Margaret took it in her hand, feeling its cool surface, and for a moment she allowed herself to simply be still. The wind whispered through the branches above, and the leaves rustled softly, as if the tree itself were breathing in the evening air. It was the same rhythm that had been there for generations, the same gentle pulse that connected everything, the tree, the earth, the village, and the sky. Margaret closed her eyes, her thoughts quieting as she held the stone. There was no urgency here, no need to rush or solve anything. She could simply be present, allowing the quiet of the oak to soothe her mind. It was a moment of connection, a reminder that she, too, was part of something larger, something older than her own life, something that had endured through all the changes of the world. She placed the stone back in the hollow, letting it rest gently among the other offerings. There was no need for words, no need for explanation. The tree would hold the gift, as it had held so many before, and in return, it would offer its quiet presence, its steadfastness, and its peace. As Margaret stood and turned to leave, she felt lighter than she had before. The restlessness in her heart had faded, replaced by a deep sense of calm. The oak with its quiet endurance had reminded her that she, too, could endure. There would be challenges ahead, as there always were, but in moments like this, beneath the boughs of the ancient tree, she found a quiet strength that would carry her through. The lantern in the village square flickered in the distance, casting a soft glow over the streets. The world was settling into the calm of night, and Margaret walked back toward the village, her heart full of the oak's quiet wisdom. The hollow oak would always be there, a quiet sentinel in the distance, a reminder of the enduring peace that could be found in the stillness of the land. The evening harvest. As the days began to shorten and the air grew cooler, the fields outside the village took on a golden hue. The crops, which had grown thick and lush through the summer months, were now ripe for harvest, and the village bustled with the soft murmur of work. The rhythm of the year had come full circle, and it was time to gather the fruits of the land that had sustained the village through the long, warm months. The evening harvest was a quiet affair, one that was almost sacred in its simplicity. The workers moved with slow, steady movements, their hands skilled at gathering the grains, vegetables, and fruits that had been carefully tended over the seasons. There was no rush, no hurry to finish. The harvest was as much a part of the land as the land was a part of them. Each sheaf of wheat, each bundle of herbs, was collected with care, as though the earth itself had given them a gift that deserved to be treated with the utmost respect. Margaret, who had spent much of the day tending to the sick and injured in the village, found herself drawn to the fields in the late afternoon, as the shadows grew longer and the air took on a crispness that promised the coming of fall. The work in the fields was familiar to her, a rhythm that had been passed down from her mother and grandmother, and before them, from the elders of the village. The harvest, though demanding, was a time for quiet reflection, a time when the fruits of the earth were gathered and stored for the colder months ahead. As she made her way to the edge of the field, Margaret could see the others already at work. A few of the men were bending low to gather the last of the barley, while the women and children worked in the vegetable patches, carefully picking the last of the summer's bounty. The air was filled with the scent of fresh earth, the sweet fragrance of ripe fruit, and the soft rustle of the leaves as they were stirred by the breeze. Margaret walked slowly, taking in the scene with a quiet smile. The village was like a family, its work divided among its people, each person contributing to the whole. And though the harvest was a time of labor, it was also a time of connection, of working together to ensure that the coming winter would be one of warmth and sustenance. She paused beside a row of berry bushes, their dark fruit glistening in the fading light. The berries, plump and ripe, had been nurtured by the summer sun and the rains, and now they were ready to be picked. Margaret reached out and plucked a handful of them, their juice staining her fingers as she held them. She paused for a moment, savoring the sweetness of the fruit, feeling the coolness of the evening air on her skin. It was a simple pleasure, one that many took for granted, but in that quiet moment, it felt like a small miracle. As she walked further into the field, she found the others working in a rhythm that seemed to blend seamlessly with the land. The tall stalks of wheat swayed gently in the breeze, their heads heavy with grain. The workers moved with practiced ease, their hands sweeping through the stalks, gathering the golden kernels and bundling them carefully to be carried back to the barn. The sound of the sickle cutting through the stalks was a soft rhythmic sound, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Margaret joined them, her hands moving in time with the others. There was no need for words, the work spoke for itself. The harvest was a time for quiet labor, for honoring the earth and the gifts it gave. As the sun sank lower in the sky, casting a soft orange glow over the fields, the workers continued their task, moving in a slow, steady dance with the land. The evening air grew cooler as the sky darkened, and the workers began to gather the last of the crops. The day had been long, and though the work was hard, there was a deep satisfaction in the accomplishment. The barn would soon be filled with the bounty of the land: wheat, barley, oats, vegetables, and fruit, all carefully stored for the coming months. It was a time of preparation, a time of laying the foundation for the winter that was sure to come. As the final bundles were gathered and carried back to the barn, the village began to settle into a quiet stillness. The work of the harvest was done, and though the land had given much, there was a sense of gratitude in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the earth's gifts and the hands that had worked to bring them to fruition. Margaret, her arms tired from the day's work, stood for a moment at the edge of the field, watching the last of the harvest being carried in. The evening sky was darkening now, the first stars twinkling in the cool air. She felt a deep sense of peace in her heart, knowing that the village would be ready for the winter ahead. The land had provided, and the people had worked together to ensure that they would not go hungry in the coming months. As she made her way back to her cottage, the soft sounds of the night surrounding her, Margaret felt a quiet satisfaction. The harvest was a reminder that life, though fleeting, was also abundant. The earth, with all its quiet rhythms and steady cycles, would continue to provide, and the people of the village would continue to honor it, as they always had. And so, as the night settled in and the village grew still, Margaret allowed herself a moment of rest, knowing that in the morning, the work would begin again. But for now there was only the quiet of the evening, the satisfaction of the harvest, and the promise of the seasons to come. The quiet between storms. The wind had begun to shift. It wasn't loud, nor sharp, but rather a subtle turning, like the breath of the land drawing inward. The last of the harvest had been tucked away in barns and cellars, and for a few days, the village allowed itself to slow. There was always more to do, animals to care for, thatch to patch, tools to mend. But the great rush of the harvest had passed. In the lull that followed, a quietness settled like mist in the low fields and corners of the lanes. No one called it a holiday, but the villagers knew it was a time to move slowly. Feet dragged just a little more on the footpath. Children played a bit longer by the stream, and the grown-ups leaned on their brooms and rakes for a moment longer, their eyes tracing the movement of clouds overhead. It was the space between labor and winter, between the long hours of fieldwork and the long nights to come. Almer the cobbler had taken to sitting on his bench just outside his little workshop, a mug of cider warming in his hands. He rarely drank much, but this season's cider had turned out well, and it pleased him to sip it slowly, as he watched the comings and goings of the village. He had begun repairing boots in the mornings, and setting them on a wooden board to dry in the sun by afternoon. Now and then a passing child would stop to admire the polished leather, and he'd offer them a smile, a wink, and a sliver of dried apple from the pouch at his side. Not far from Almer's bench, old Willa sat shelling beans. Her fingers worked without hurry, her lap full of empty pods, and her basket filling slowly. She hummed quietly to herself, though the song had no words, just a melody that wandered as freely as the breeze. It was a tune her own mother had hummed, and her mother before her. In the quiet between storms, the old songs often returned, like birds to a hedge. Along the southern edge of the village, where the hedgerows bowed gently in the wind, a group of women gathered to braid onions and hang herbs. They worked with their sleeves rolled high, voices low and steady, talking not about the future, but about the present. Who had milked the cow that morning? Whose goat had broken the latch? Whether the last batch of pickled turnips had turned out right? It was the sort of talk that made the world feel stable and close. Even the livestock seemed to sense the pause. The chickens pecked more lazily around the yard, content with scraps and scattered feed. The pigs wallowed in the last of the soft mud, before the frosts would harden the ground. The oxen, freed from the heavy plough, stood quiet and slow-eyed near the fence, their great sides rising and falling in unhurried rhythm. In the middle of the day, the sun broke through the clouds in long golden stripes that lay like fallen banners across the common. Children chased each other through the light and shade, shouting and tumbling, while the older ones lay in the grass, fingers twisting stray stalks into rough crowns and necklaces. There were no tasks pressing them forward, no bells ringing for labor, just the hours unfolding like a gentle yawn. Inside the cottages, the hush deepened. Bread baked slowly in warm ovens, and the smell of it filled the air. Elders rested in chairs near the hearth, their eyes half-lidded, not asleep, but not quite awake. The heat from the fire worked its way into old bones, easing the stiffness of many seasons. A few stirred a pot or mended a torn shawl, but none moved quickly. The quiet had made its home there. Even the priest walked more softly these days. Father Edric, who usually moved with a determined step and spoke with a steady voice, had taken to longer pauses between sentences. His prayers at twilight stretched gently like the smoke from the village chimneys, rising slowly, without urgency. In the hush of the chapel, one could hear the soft crackle of candle wicks and the shifting of wooden beams in the cooling air. As evening came, the skies hinted at change. A thin mist began to form in the low ground beyond the fences, and the clouds thickened with that soft woolly look that often came before the rains. But it was not the storm yet, only the whisper of one. The wind moved through the trees with the sound of old cloth dragging along stone, and the leaves, dry and curled, danced softly across the paths. Inside Margaret's cottage, the shutters were drawn, and a single lamp cast a pool of light across the table. She was sewing a patch into a blanket, her needle glinting every now and then as it caught the light. Outside, the village held its breath, not in fear or worry, but in a kind of reverence. There are moments in the life of a place when everything waits, when even the wind seems to say, not yet. The storm would come, it always did, the rains, the frost, the long dark of winter, but not tonight. Tonight, the fires burned low and steady, the dogs lay curled in doorways, the chickens roosted high in their coop, the people rested in their beds or near their hearths, their thoughts quiet, their dreams already drifting. And in the space between harvest and snow, the village slept beneath a sky full of silent stars. The scent of tallow and ash. The morning light came slowly, filtered through a pale sky streaked with the faintest grey. It was the kind of dawn that softened the edges of things, where fences looked like smudges and trees stood as quiet silhouettes. Smoke curled from the thatched chimneys, thin at first, then thicker as the hearths within each cottage stirred to life. The scent of tallow and ash, old and familiar, settled over the village like a blanket. It was the season of candles now. The tall ones for the chapel had already been poured, stored upright in the cool of the vestry. But the common folk needed their share too. Small, stubby tapers for kitchens, smoky ones for barns, smooth little rounds of wax and rough coils of fat-soaked string for sheds and sleeping lofts. Tallow was no luxury. It was made from what could be spared, rendered down with patience and poured by hand into moulds, or dipped again and again until the taper grew thick enough to hold a flame. At the edge of the village, near the old lean-to behind the cooper's yard, Oswin and his daughters were at work before the sun had cleared the tops of the willows. A large pot, blackened from many years of use, hung over a slow fire. Inside, a mixture of sheep fat and scraps of lard was melting down, bubbling softly, and letting off a scent that mingled with the wood smoke and stuck to the wool of their cloaks. Oswin stirred the pot with a wooden rod, patient and steady. His daughters, Edith and Scylla, took turns dipping the long wicks into the hot fat, letting them cool on the racks nearby before dipping again. The process was slow, repetitive, and filled with the quiet that often came with practiced labor. They spoke little, not from lack of words, but from the rhythm of the task that made speech seem unnecessary. Every so often, a villager would come by with a bundle of their own, strips of cloth twisted into wicks, scraps of fat saved from the last slaughter, beeswax from summer hives. They waited their turn, then offered what they had, watching as Edith or Scylla added it to the pot, or helped them with the first few dips. No one was turned away. In these months, when darkness stretched long over the land, light was something shared, not hoarded. Further into the village, the hearths burned low, and the ash was carefully gathered into buckets. Ash for soap, for cleaning, for scouring pans and keeping insects from the root cellar. The lye made from it had a sharp scent and a sting to the touch, but it was useful in ways nothing else was. Anwin, the weaver's widow, spent the better part of her morning mixing her lye water in an old wooden trough, whispering to herself as she worked, her hands steady from years of habit. Around her cottage, the world was muted. The leaves had mostly fallen now, and the trees stood bare, their bones showing against the grey sky. The wind rattled the empty branches, but didn't howl, not yet. This was the stillness before the harder cold, the last days before snow. Inside each home, the work was soft-footed and low-voiced. Threads were spun and knotted into nets. Baskets were mended, clay cups repaired with strips of leather or little nails. Mothers taught daughters how to twist rushes into wicks. Fathers showed sons how to shave wood for kindling without wasting a sliver. It was the kind of teaching done not through speech, but through doing, with a nod here, a quiet correction there, and always, the scent of tallow lingered. It clung to hair and sleeves, to the folds of cloaks and the grain of old wood. It was not sweet like beeswax, nor bright like pine, but it was comforting in its own way, a sign that the village was preparing, that winter could come and still, there would be light. By mid-afternoon, the first candles were set on shelves to cool. Some were crooked, others knobbly with little bubbles beneath their skins. None of them were perfect, but each would burn, each would chase back the dark when the sun slipped away early and the winds crept in. Oswin examined a batch of thick tapers with a nod, then handed one to his youngest daughter, who held it like a treasure before wrapping it in a scrap of linen. In the chapel, Father Edric prepared the altar for evening prayers. He lit one of the tall beeswax candles, the flame dancing gently as it caught. He paused, watching the flicker and the way the light played across the stone floor, across the faces of the wooden saints, worn smooth by time. Outside, the hush of the village deepened. As evening settled, the shutters were drawn, and the candles lit. The glow was soft, golden, and small in each home, but it was enough. People sat closer to their hearths, hands wrapped around mugs of broth or bits of sewing. Shadows flickered on walls as stories were told, not loudly, but with the slow unfolding that suited the season. The village was quiet, not because it was afraid, but because it was ready. The scent of tallow and ash filled every corner, reminding all who lived there that the dark had come before and would come again, but they had always had what they needed to see it through. The hidden ways of frost. The first frost came without ceremony. No great cloud, no thunder, no howl of wind, just the quiet hush of dawn, and a pale shimmer that coated the world like a breath held in silence. It settled on rooftops and hedges, over the stubbled fields and bare branches, a thin veil of white that turned the village silver before the light had fully arrived. Old Fina was the first to notice. She always rose before the sun, her steps soft on the packed earth of her cottage floor. She opened her door to the dark stillness, and there it was, the frost, clinging to the grass like dust from another world. She stood a long moment in the doorway, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching her breath drift into the cold. It was not yet the deep freeze of midwinter. The wells were still open, and the streams still ran. But the earth had changed overnight. The stones felt colder underfoot, the air sharper in the throat. Even the animals moved differently. Cattle lowing softly before the sun rose, the hens fluffing their feathers twice as much, and the barn cats curling tighter in their nests of straw. Across the village, shutters opened more slowly. People peered out into the brightness that came with the frost, not the brightness of heat, but that quiet, colorless glow that made everything seem still. Children, wrapped in cloaks and mittens, tapped at puddles with sticks to see the ice crack. It was a kind of magic, this fragile skin the water wore. In the southern croft, where the path turned along the hedgerow, Thomas the swineherd had laid down new straw for his pigs. He chuckled to himself watching them nudge their snouts beneath the hay, looking for warmth, snorting at the strange bite in the air. He scattered extra peelings and patted the old boar on the flank, his breath puffing in steady clouds. Inside the cottages, fires were coaxed from embers with care. Each spark was precious now. Bundles of kindling were guarded closely, and each log placed with the deliberate patience that came from knowing there'd be many more cold mornings to come. The hearth had always been the heart of every home, but in frost season it became the keeper of time itself. In the space behind the chapel, where the garden herbs had once flourished, Edric now walked the frost-covered path with slow measured steps. His boots crunched the grass beneath, leaving footprints that would fade with the sun. He paused by the rosemary bush, its leaves silvered and brittle, and gently brushed his hand along a frozen branch. Even in the cold, it gave off a faint scent, sharp and green, a ghost of warmer days. That day, no great task waited. The villagers busied themselves with the small things, the necessary things. Mats were shaken out and hung to air. Root vegetables were checked for spoilage in their bins. Nettles were boiled with honey to keep coughs at bay. And always, there was the business of watching the weather, watching the trees, listening to the sounds the frost made when it settled into the grain of doors or cracked along the beams. The woods were quieter now. No birds sang in the early morning, and the leaves that still clung to the oaks moved only when touched by the lightest wind. Paths grew harder, crunching beneath leather soles, but some still wandered out into the cold, for a bit of firewood, or to check on the traps along the stream's edge, or simply to walk with their thoughts. Anwin, the weaver's widow, walked alone that morning, along the eastern edge, where the ground sloped toward the fields. She carried no basket, no bundle, only her walking stick and her thoughts. The frost beneath her steps crackled gently, and she hummed to herself, a soft melody meant only for the trees. It was her way of marking the season, this walk, of greeting the cold, not with fear, but with familiarity. By afternoon, the sun rose high enough to melt the frost from the rooftops. Drops of water fell like ticking clocks onto the stone sills below. But in the shadowed places, beneath the eaves, in the ruts of the lane, along the north walls of the cottages, the frost remained, stubborn and pale, a quiet reminder that the season had turned its face toward winter. Children returned indoors with red cheeks and stiff fingers, their laughter giving way to yawns. Mothers rubbed their hands warm, and set them to kneading dough, while the scent of baking drifted out once more. Fathers rubbed shoulders and knuckles with wax or wool, the stiffness of frost settling into joints that had long known such change. By evening, the world had softened again. The firelight danced in cottage windows, and the smoke rose more steadily now. Candles flickered, and woolen blankets were pulled up a little higher. The villagers spoke softly, if at all. The frost had a way of making the world seem larger and quieter, as if the sky listened more closely when the earth lay still. And so the night came, gentle and sure. Beneath the dark, the village rested. The fields gleamed under moonlight, silver-edged and silent, and in every corner, from the lofts to the root cellars, from the hayricks to the chapel, the frost settled like a whispered secret, never loud, never cruel, only patient, waiting. The window beside the loom. There was a small window in the east wall of Anwin's cottage, set just above the bench where her loom stood. It was no grand window, just a square of thick, bubbled glass, leaded at the edges, and often smudged with the breath of cooking smoke and time. But it caught the morning light in a way that turned the rough wool of the cottage into something golden. For a few quiet hours each day the sun would rise across the hills, press gently through that pane, and lay a slant of brightness across her hands as she worked. The loom itself was old, older than most things in the village, brought down from her mother, and her mother before that. The wood had been darkened by years of oil and use, its corners smoothed by the constant turn of fingers, the shuttle fit in her palm like a well-worn stone. Each thread was a memory, each warp a tether to the seasons that had passed. On this morning, the light came gently, filtered through the frost still clinging to the glass. Outside, the village was just beginning to stir. The frost was thicker this day, and the smoke from each chimney rose slowly, hanging low before being drawn into the pale blue sky. A quiet cold had settled deep in the thatch and stones, and even the crows on the fence posts seemed slower to move. Inside the cottage, Anwin wrapped a shawl tighter around her shoulders and bent to her weaving. The cloth on the loom was thick winter wool, undyed, simple, strong. It was not meant to impress. It was meant to keep someone warm through the hardest nights. She had promised it to young Ida, the baker's daughter, for a cloak to wear when walking to the ovens before the sun rose. That walk was a cold one now, and the cloak would carry the heat of Anwin's hearth in every strand. Her hands worked slowly, but with purpose, over, under, beat, draw. The rhythm of the loom filled the room like soft footfalls in snow. Each time the shuttle passed through the threads, it left a whisper behind, and as the cloth grew beneath her fingers, so too did the hush within the cottage. Through the little window, Anwen could see the lane that led down toward the common well. A few villagers passed that way, bundled in wool, scarves pulled high, boots leaving faint prints that would melt by midday. She watched them between passes of the shuttle, not to eavesdrop, but to feel the nearness of the world beyond her walls. At midday, a knock came gently to her door. It was Ida herself, with a bundle of bread wrapped in cloth, an offering of thanks before the cloak was even finished. Anwen smiled as she accepted it, her fingers brushing Ida's cold ones, and invited her in to warm by the fire. They spoke little, just a few words exchanged with hands outstretched to the flames, and then Ida was off again, back to the ovens, back to her own quiet rhythm. Anwen returned to the loom. Outside the light shifted, the frost slowly disappearing from the window. The glass, once clouded with ice, now showed a clearer picture, the smoke of the village, the rooftops like resting beasts, the slow movement of winter days. She traced the pattern of the cloth with her fingers, and thought of the warmth it would bring, of how many such pieces she had woven over the years, and how each one still walked the village, wrapped around someone she knew. In the afternoon she set aside the shuttle, and moved to the hearth. The fire needed feeding, and her knees creaked as she stood. She stirred the pot that hung from the iron hook, the scent of leek and barley rising like an old song. She dipped a small bowl for herself and sat once more by the loom, eating slowly, the steam curling up past her face and catching in the light from the window. Even as the day began to dim, she did not light the candles straight away. There was something comforting in the way the shadows lengthened across the wool, how the colors of the world turned soft and gray. She worked until her eyes could no longer see the threads clearly, then folded the half-finished cloth and set it beside the window, where the last light touched it like a promise. Outside, the village moved toward evening. Chickens were ushered into coops, the last buckets drawn from the well, doors closed softly, shutters pulled tight. Fires crackled to life in hearths all along the lane, and the smoke from the chimneys thickened again in the cooling air. In Anwen's cottage, the candle was finally lit. Its flame wavered gently in the draught from the window, and she leaned forward to shield it as she trimmed the wick. She looked once more through the glass, now darkened, reflecting only the glow of her fire, and her face, quiet and still. The loom stood silent now, but the cloth beside it was warm to the touch, as if it remembered the hands that made it. She reached out and pressed her palm to the glass, cold on one side, warmth on the other, and between them, only the faint pain and the hush of nightfall. The hedge beyond, the hazel copse, beyond the last bend in the path, where the hazel trees grew thick and low, there stood a hedge that marked the edge of the tended world. It was not a tall hedge, nor a neat one. Brambles tangled in its roots, and old elder branches leaned into the lane with a kind of drowsy grace. But it had stood there for as long as anyone remembered, and none who passed it did so without noticing. The hedge separated the common fields from the outer wood, those quiet reaches where the land turned wilder, where the trees were older, and the paths less worn. Children were told not to go past it without cause, not because of fear, but out of respect. The hedge was a threshold, a soft boundary, and on this crisp winter morning, it was covered in a fine lace of frost, every twig and thorn sparkling, as if dressed for a festival no one had called. Wilm the cooper stood before it, his breath curling from his beard. He had come early, sack in hand, to gather hazel rods for binding. He liked to walk the outer lanes before others stirred. There was quiet to be found there, not silence, but the kind of quiet that lives in rustling branches and soft bird feet hopping over frost. He paused before stepping off the path, laying a hand gently on the hedge, as if greeting an old friend. Beyond it, the hazels grew thick and close, their trunks pale against the low winter sun. Wilm stepped carefully, avoiding the worst of the brambles, his boots crackling over leaf litter frozen firm. He moved with the ease of one who knew the land well. A few steps in, he found what he was looking for, slender shoots of this year's growth, perfect for bending into barrels and hoops. He began to cut them, one by one, stacking them neatly in his sack. Now and then he stopped and listened, not because he feared anything, but because the stillness asked for it. There were sounds, always, distant tapping of a woodpecker, the slow creak of branches, the sudden flutter of a thrush disturbed from its perch. The woods in winter held no hurry. Time moved differently there. Back in the village, smoke was beginning to rise, fires had been kindled, and the first doors opened. But here, among the hazels, it felt as if the world had paused. The sun filtered through the thicket in narrow beams, casting soft shapes across the undergrowth, and in that moment, Wilm let his work slow. He found a fallen log, cleared it of frost with his sleeve, and sat. The sack of rods lay beside him. His hands rested on his knees. He remembered, faintly, how his grandfather used to speak of the hedge, not as a wall, but as a marker, a place where things changed, where the wind smelled different, and the birds flew in quieter lines. The hedge, he'd said once, was a place where stories waited. Not stories of dragons or heroes, but small ones, forgotten ones, the kind that lived in the curl of a fern or the hollow under a root. Wilm looked down and saw a bit of movement in the frost, just a beetle, slow with the cold, making its steady way across a leaf. He watched it with the same attention he gave to the shaping of a barrel's rim. There was something about these small things that felt honest, no rush, no need for anything more than being there. He rose after a while and hoisted the sack over his shoulder. The sun had climbed a little higher, melting the frost from the tallest branches, but the ground remained hard. He retraced his steps, back through the hazels, careful not to tread over the same roots twice. As he reached the hedge again he paused. This time he didn't just pass. He turned, looked back toward the woods, and nodded, just once, as if to thank the place for letting him walk there. Then he stepped over the hedge and back into the worn lane, where the prints of boots and cartwheels waited to take him home. As he passed by the corner, where the path narrowed and the village roofs came into view, he saw Magda the thatcher carrying a bundle of dried reeds. They exchanged a quiet wave, nothing more, each going their own way, each carrying part of the winter's work. By midday the rods Wilm had gathered were soaking in the trough near his workshop. He'd boil them later to soften the bark, then shape them with his draw knife, while the fire cracked and spat in the corner. But for now he stood in the doorway, with a mug of warm cider, watching the steam rise from the wood, listening to the familiar creak of the village as it moved through another winter's day. The hedge beyond the hazels would remain where it always had, slowly thawing in the pale light, holding the shape of every breath of wind that passed through it. Most would forget it was there until spring. But for Wilm and a few others who still walked the outer lanes, it was not forgotten. It waited in its quiet corner, like an old friend, unchanged and always changing. The pot hung on the hook. In the heart of every cottage in the village, there was a hearth, and in the heart of every hearth, there was a hook. Iron forged, blackened with age and use, it hung from the beam above and cradled the pot that fed the house. It was a simple thing, unmoving, creaking only slightly when the wind found its way through the stones, but it held more hours than any clock and more stories than any book. In Wulfred's home, the pot was never empty for long. Even when the food was meagre, there was always something to put in. A carrot grown lopsided from the edge of the garden, a bit of salt pork scraped from the barrel, an onion with one soft side cut away. Wulfred was no farmer and no soldier. He was a spoon carver, known for his quiet hands and his habit of humming while he worked. He lived alone, but rarely went unnoticed. Folk often knocked on his door, not just for a spoon, but for a moment of calm, a seat by his fire, and maybe a bowl from that dependable pot. This morning, the hook creaked softly as the pot swung gently over the flames. The coals beneath it glowed a deep, steady red. A thin curl of steam rose from the lid, winding its way into the rafters. Wulfred sat near, shaving thin ribbons of wood from a block of alder, shaping the curve of a new ladle, with long, even strokes. His dog, Bramble, lay curled near his boots, tail flicking in her sleep. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, not thickly, but with a soft insistence, laying a new hush over the rooftops and lanes. The thatch on the cottages bore it like a blanket, and the trees stood still, their bare branches catching flakes like secret letters from the sky. The sound of the village had changed with the weather, muffled footsteps, distant thuds of firewood splitting, and the occasional laugh carried from behind shutters. Inside, the world was simpler. The only sounds were the scrape of knife on wood, the bubbling breath of the pot, and the occasional pop from the fire. Wulfred looked up from his work now and then, glancing toward the hearth to check the boil, then toward the small window where the falling snow traced gentle patterns. The light was pale and grey, but it caught the edge of his tools just enough to keep him going. Around midday, there came a knock at the door, soft and polite. Wulfred set down his ladle and wiped his hands on the cloth draped over his knee. Bramble gave a short thump of her tail, but didn't rise. At the threshold stood Lenny, the cobbler's apprentice, carrying a small parcel wrapped in wool. She looked flushed from the cold, her boots dusted white. "Da says thank you," she said, holding out the parcel. "For the stirring spoon. He says it's better than the iron one." Wulfred chuckled and took the bundle. "Tell him it'll stir better if he sings to it." she grinned. I'll tell him. Come in a while, he offered. The pot's warm. She stepped inside, brushing snow from her shoulders. The warmth met her like a friend. They sat by the hearth, and Wilfred ladled out 2 bowls from the pot, barley and root, a bit of bacon, and just a hint of wild garlic dried from summer. Lenny sipped carefully, holding the bowl in both hands, and they watched the fire together. I like your house, she said after a time. It smells like soup and wood. That's what houses are meant to smell like, Wilfred replied. She nodded, not arguing. After she left, thanking him again, and pulling her hood up against the wind, Wilfred returned to his chair. The ladle was nearly finished now, just the final smoothing, the soft sanding. He leaned over, checked the pot, and added a splash of water, a pinch of salt. The hook creaked again as he adjusted it higher, letting the simmer slow. It was not just a pot, not really. It was the pulse of the house. It had boiled for guests and kin, for laughter and quiet tears. It had fed those who came empty-handed, and those who came bearing too much. It had boiled during storms, and during seasons of plenty. It had heard more prayers than the chapel's stone floor, though not one had been spoken aloud. As night began to fall, and the snow deepened its hold on the village, Wilfred lit the candle on the mantel, and leaned back in his chair. Bramble shifted, and let out a long sigh. The pot hung steady over the embers, still warm, still waiting, and somewhere in the crackle of the fire, and the fading daylight, the cottage held its peace like a cupped hand, quiet and enduring. The tally stone by the mill path. Down where the road sloped toward the stream, and the wheel of the old mill turned slow even in winter's grip, there lay a stone half buried in the earth. Most passed it by without notice, worn smooth with age, moss curling over its edges. But it had stood there for generations, quiet and enduring, like so many things in the village. It was called the tally stone, a name passed on more than explained. No carving marked it, no script. But those who walked the mill path often glanced at it, even if they didn't mean to. Some would touch it as they passed, 2 fingers brushing the edge, as though counting something lost to memory. Today the stone lay rimmed with frost, and the ruts in the path around it were frozen stiff. The mill itself hummed with the slow, rhythmic groan of the turning wheel. The stream had not frozen over, but it moved with care, thick, sluggish, dark beneath the pale skin of ice that clung to its edges. Elric, the miller's boy, was up early, as he always was. His boots were soaked through before dawn had properly risen. He'd broken ice at the edge of the trough, and hauled sacks of barley from the storage bin to the grinding stones. The wheel turned, the stones ground, and flour drifted like mist into the waiting bins. The work was loud up close, clatter and thud, creak and churn. But outside, beyond the splashing of the stream, all was still. He stepped out after the mid-morning shift, brushing flour from his sleeves. The air was sharp, clean in the way it only got when snow had settled overnight. A dusting had clung to the rooftops and the hedges. He made his way up the path toward the village with a wrapped loaf under one arm, part payment from the baker for yesterday's grind. When he passed the tally stone, he slowed. His shadow stretched long across it, the pale light making it look older than usual. He paused and knelt beside it, not because he had to, just because he often did. Elric didn't know who had started it, or when, but the children of the village had a habit. One passed between games and chores, always whispered rather than taught. Each time someone had done a good turn, carried water for an elder, mended a broken fence rail, shared a crust with a dog, someone would place a pebble beside the stone. The pebbles didn't stay, rain would wash them away, or wind would scatter them, but the habit remained, a quiet way to mark kindness, to keep a sort of record that mattered only to those who understood it. There were 3 pebbles there today, one small and pale, one dark and round, one shaped almost like a heart. Elric reached into his pocket and pulled out a smooth stone he'd found days ago near the edge of the field. He placed it gently beside the others, then stood, wiped his hands on his tunic, and continued up the hill. Behind him, the mill wheel turned on. A gull passed overhead, calling once before vanishing into the bright clouds, and the tally stone remained, watching as it always had without asking. Later that afternoon, as the sun slipped behind the low hills and the cold returned to the path in earnest, old Greta came walking slowly down toward the stream. Her knees ached in the cold, and she leaned heavy on her walking stick, but she came anyway. She always came. When she reached the stone she bent, not far, not quickly, but far enough to lay a finger on one of the pebbles. She did not move it. She just smiled, and said, still counted then, By dusk the snow had begun to fall again, soft and swirling like flour shaken from a cloth. The pebbles would be buried before morning. The path would seem untouched, but come the next clear day, someone would stop and kneel again. Another stone would be left, another tally made, and the village would carry on, as it always had, in the quiet spaces between one kindness and the next. The lantern on the post. At the edge of the green, just before the lane dipped toward the woods, there stood a post, not tall, not grand, just a length of oak sunk deep into the frozen ground, weather-dark and slightly leaning. Fastened near its top was an iron bracket, curled at the end like a shepherd's crook, and from that hung the village lantern. It wasn't lit often. Oil was dear, and most had their own hearths to light their way. But the lantern was there all the same, hanging like a promise, or a memory, and some nights it would glow soft, steady, and sure. Tonight was one of those nights. The air had turned colder as the sun fell behind the trees. A low frost crept over the thatch and window sills, turning every surface to silver. The sky was a deep velvet blue, scattered with stars that blinked like old friends watching from afar. And from the lantern, a small, golden light pushed back the dark, pooling faintly at the base of the post, painting long shadows onto the rutted lane. It was Aldith who lit it. She always had. Her father had done so before her, and his mother before him. The task was not written down nor required by any lord, but it was known, and it was kept. On certain nights, when someone was due back late from the next village, or when a traveller had been spotted on the distant ridge, the lantern would be filled, the wick trimmed, and the flame coaxed to life. Aldith's hands were stiff with age, but they knew the feel of the lantern's latch, the exact tug needed to lift it free, the quiet way to shield the match from the wind. She stood with her shawl drawn tight, breath fogging in the air, waiting to be sure the flame caught firm. Tonight, she thought of young Emmett, the cooper's son, walking back from Fenfield, where he'd gone for nails and resin. He wouldn't be back until well after moonrise. The lantern was for him, mostly, and for anyone else who might find the woods too quiet, the turn of the lane too dark. She hung the lantern back on its post, and gave it a small tap with the back of her knuckle, just to see it sway a little. It moved like it remembered something. Then she turned and made her way home, her boots crunching over the frost-glazed earth. Behind her, the lantern glowed on. As the evening deepened, others took notice. A group of children, wrapped in cloaks, paused their game to look toward the light. "Someone's coming," one whispered, though no one was sure who. The smith, on his way to check his shutters, glanced at it too, and nodded to himself, as if it meant something he didn't need to say aloud. Down in the hollow, by the water's edge, the woodcutter's wife paused in her gathering, and turned her face toward the glow. She smiled, softly, though no one saw. The flame flickered slightly as the wind rose, but it held. Hours passed. The village fell quiet, as it always did, one home at a time. Curtains drawn, doors latched, dogs curled close to the embers. Yet the lantern stayed, its warm circle of light spilling out over the lane, waiting. Near midnight, there came the sound of boots on frozen mud. Emmett, shoulders hunched, pack heavy with the cooper's goods, rounded the bend with a tired sigh. He saw the light before he saw the post, and for a moment, he stood still in it, just letting it fall across his face, letting the quiet of it settle into his chest. He touched the post in passing, a gesture like a thank you, and turned down the lane toward home. The light stayed behind him, flickering gently in the wind, unbothered by the cold, undimmed by the hour. It would burn until morning. That was the way of it. The lantern didn't speak. It didn't point or instruct or demand. It simply waited, lit by hands that remembered, for those who wandered, and for the peace that came with knowing. Even on the darkest nights, someone had thought to leave the light on. The willow passed the fence. Beyond the far field, where the sheep rarely strayed and the hedgerow thickened into thicket, there stood an old willow. Its branches hung low and soft like strands of forgotten cloth, dipping and swaying in a windless rhythm, as though moved by breath instead of breeze. Most folk in the village knew of it, but few went near. It stood just past the last fence post, where the stone wall ended and the common faded into a quiet patch of untended earth, neither field nor forest, not quite wild, but not truly claimed. The kind of place where stories start but never quite finish, where whispers collect in the shadows and the moss grows over things long set down and left. The willow was not marked on any map, nor spoken of with ceremony, yet it had been there for longer than any living soul could say. No one remembered planting it, and no one ever trimmed it. Its roots ran deep, beneath the frost line and into soil long untouched by spade. In summer, its leaves shimmered like green silk. In winter it stood bare and bowed, its long limbs brushing the frozen ground. Marta, the shepherd's daughter, knew the willow better than most. She'd discovered it by accident as a child, chasing after a lamb that had slipped through the hedge. She had pushed past nettles and alder branches, boots catching on roots, and emerged into a clearing of uneven light and stillness. There it had been, tall, curved and quiet, in a way that stilled her heart. She had stepped under its arms and felt something shift. The sound of the world behind her dulled, no bird song, no wind, no voices. Even the lamb had gone silent, standing not far from her, looking up into the branches, as if it too had remembered something it had never been told. Since that day she had returned often, though never with company. The willow was not the sort of place you brought others. It wasn't secret, exactly, it simply didn't ask to be shared. Today, Marta wandered back there again. The morning had broken with pale light and hard frost. The village rooftops glittered beneath the rising sun, and the breath of the oxen in the paddock came in soft puffs like smoke. Marta had risen early, as always, to tend to the sheep and walk the lines of the fence. But there had been a quiet about the day that invited more than duty. Something in the shape of the clouds, or the stillness of the birds, had turned her feet toward the willow once more. She crossed the meadow slowly, taking the long way through the alder grove, letting her fingers trail along the coarse bark of the trees. Her boots left faint impressions in the frost, which sparkled and crunched beneath each step. Overhead, the branches of the birch swayed gently, though no breeze could be felt. The hush of winter was still thick over the land, but the light was beginning to change. Spring would come soon, and with it the rush of planting, tending, and the endless march of days marked by toil, but not yet. Not this morning. She came to the fence and stepped through a break in the low stones, careful not to disturb the nest of a hare tucked under the bramble. The willow rose ahead, silver-grey and soft in the sunlight, draped like an old memory. Its limbs reached low, touching the ground in places, as if folding around something sacred. Marta stepped into the shade and paused. Always there was that moment when the world shifted, when the sounds of birds and breath seemed to hush, and the very air changed weight. She had never spoken of it, not to her mother, nor to her brothers, not even to old Tamsin, who knew more about trees and herbs than anyone in 3 parishes. Some silences are better left undisturbed. She settled down near the base of the trunk, on a patch of earth softened by fallen leaves and old roots. The willow had a hollow in its center wide enough for a child to hide in, and she had done so once years ago during a storm that had come up too fast from the west. She had stayed there, tucked inside the tree, while thunder rolled and rain lashed the grass. She remembered the way the trunk had trembled beneath her hands, not in fear, but in sympathy, as though the tree understood the storm and had lived through worse. Now, with her back against its side, she let her eyes drift to the high, pale sky. A kestrel wheeled far above, barely more than a shape against the sun. Below, the land lay still, fallow fields, rows of hedgerow, the shadow of the village far behind. She reached into her satchel and took out a bit of bread wrapped in linen. It was cold, slightly dry at the edges, but still good. She ate slowly, chewing without hurry, crumbs falling into her lap. A beetle climbed across her boot, steady and unaware. Time passed differently beneath the willow. It always had. She remembered again her grandfather, old Linnet, with his bent back and slow speech. He had told her once that some trees outlived names, that a few remembered things the soil forgot. He had spoken little, but with care, and when he told her to listen to the trees, not just their creaks and rustles, but the way they waited, she had believed him. Once, just once, she had pressed her palm to the bark and asked a question out loud. She couldn't recall now what it had been, but she remembered the warmth that had spread through her fingers, the faint sound like water beneath stone that had followed. She rested her palm there now, lightly, letting it warm against the cold surface of the trunk. The willow did not answer, not directly, but something in her chest loosened, something she hadn't known was tight. Birdsong returned, faint and far away. The sun was rising higher now, stretching long beams through the curtain of bare branches. The ground was beginning to steam slightly where the frost melted away. A vole darted from one tuft of grass to another, quick and silent. Marta sighed, not from weariness, but in that way one exhales when a thought has finished itself. She stood, brushing soil from her skirts, and looked once more at the willow's curved shape, the way its branches framed the sky. She didn't need to stay longer, the quiet would follow her. She walked back slowly, picking her way over the roots, stepping through the gap in the stones, and winding along the path through the grove. She paused once to tie back her hair with a leather cord, then resumed her walk across the field, toward the distant smudge of chimney smoke and clatter of tools. But in her mind, she still carried the hush of the willow, the way its silence had a sound to it, the way its limbs had held her gaze like a cradle holds sleep. Behind her, the willow stood as it always had, untroubled, unhurrying. A place to return to, not just with steps, but with breath and stillness. A part of the world that moved not by seasons, but by memory. And perhaps, even now, it listened. Not for words, but for presence. Not for noise, but for notice. Just past the fence, just beyond the edge of map and measure, it waited. As it always had. As it always would. A loaf for the miller's son. The day began with a crust of frost laid thin across the window panes, catching the first light like tiny panes of glass sewn into the fabric of dawn. In the village hearth-house, where the bread ovens lined one warm wall and the scent of flour lingered in every crack, Elsbeth rose before the cockerel. She moved without haste, the way someone moves who has long since made peace with the rhythm of early hours. Her hands knew the weight of dough before she opened her eyes fully. They worked on memory, dipping into the flour sack, turning the water jug just so, measuring not in numbers but in feel. The dough took shape in the bowl she'd used since girlhood, smooth and elastic, faintly warm to the touch. She covered it with a cloth and placed it near the firebrick oven, then turned to light the morning coals with a handful of last night's ash, still curled grey in the corners. Outside, the first sounds of the village stirred. A gate creaked, a cart axle shifted with a soft thump. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then gave up. The sky above the thatch glowed the colour of wet wool, the sun still shy behind the hills. Today was baking day, as most days were for Elsbeth, but today held a quiet errand woven in between the ordinary, one she had not yet spoken of, not even to herself. For the miller's son Wymond had fallen ill, and though no one had said as much, the hush around his cottage and the way the older folk spoke only with glances told her enough. The lad had been well enough a week ago, laughing and tossing grain sacks onto the cart, calling out jokes as he balanced barefoot on the beam. Now the shutters of the mill house stayed drawn, and the wheel creaked slow and empty, turning only when the stream ran high. Elsbeth had thought of bringing stew, perhaps dried apple, or cloth soaked in thyme and cider, but this morning her hands had begun the bread, and the answer had come with the kneading. A loaf, that was what the day would bring. Not just any loaf, not the round ones she sold on market days, or the quick barley twists she baked for the swineherds. No, this would be a careful bread. A soft, rich dough of white flour, sifted twice, touched with egg, and sweetened with a hint of honey saved from the last summer's comb. She would lay herbs inside, rosemary perhaps, and one or two lavender petals, not for taste, but for the scent. Bread that smelled of both home and memory, bread for healing, or for comfort, or perhaps for goodbye, though she would not think that word just yet. She divided the risen dough into halves, then thirds, rolling each into a braid as she whispered to herself in a voice softer than breath. She spoke not in words, but in old sounds passed down from grandmother to mother, from mother to daughter, sounds that belonged to bread more than to language. As the oven warmed, the air filled with the rich scent of yeast and firewood. The other loaves would follow, the dark rye for the haymakers, the oat rounds for the potboys, the seed loaves for the abbot's men, but this one she would bake alone. One braid, coiled into a circle, and set into a pan lined with ash leaf. The rest could wait. By the time the sun crested the eastern ridge, the bread had browned to gold, its crust just cracking with heat. She wrapped it in linen still warm from the oven's breath, and tucked it into her satchel. Her apron smelled of smoke and grain. She wiped her hands on a cloth, and set out. The walk to the mill house wound along the river path, where the morning mist still curled low along the banks. Frost clung to the grass in white-tipped lace, and her boots pressed into the softness without sound. Above, the crows passed in lazy flight, 3 or 4 together, wings tilting against the breeze. She passed the old stone bridge, where reeds leaned over the water like watchers. The mill house lay just beyond, its sloped roof nestled into the crook of a bend, where the stream forked and narrowed into raceways for the wheel. The water wheel turned slowly now, half-heartedly, dipping into the shallows with a groan. No smoke rose from the chimney, and the shutters remained drawn. Elsbeth stood before the door, uncertain for a breath, then knocked gently, once then again. No answer came. She waited, then set the satchel down carefully beside the door. She untied the linen, and laid the loaf on the step, not too near the edge, but centered, as though placed with a question. She stood a while longer, watching the curl of frost melt from the doorway, then she turned and made her way back up the path. Behind her, she did not hear the door creak open. She did not see the hand that reached out, thin, but steady, to draw the loaf inside. She walked slowly, the kind of slow that isn't tired but thoughtful, the kind that lets the wind find your face. Her shadow followed her quietly, growing longer as the sun rose higher. At the riverbank, she stopped and leaned against the old ash tree, where she had once kissed a boy whose name she no longer remembered. She reached into her apron, and pulled out a crust of the same dough, a piece she had saved, and bit into it gently. The sweetness bloomed softly in her mouth, like a memory she hadn't meant to keep. She thought of Wymond, of his broad smile and the way he always waved twice when he passed, once for her, and once perhaps for something he didn't say. She hoped the loaf would be warm enough, soft enough, that it would say something her voice could not. The village bell tolled from across the fields, once then again. Elsbeth turned, dusted crumbs from her fingers, and resumed her walk home. Back in the hearth-house, the other loaves had cooled and waited to be wrapped. She set to it quietly, her hands moving with rhythm, with habit. Outside, the frost was melting, and the ground was beginning to show through, dull brown and soft, full of waiting things. Bread never asked questions, it only rose, and broke, and nourished. So it had always been. The path behind the granary. It was on a quiet afternoon, when the shadows grew long and the warmth of the sun settled low like a blanket across the village roofs, that Edric first noticed the path again. Not a new path. No, it had always been there, curled behind the granary like a forgotten thread at the hem of a cloak, but one that few remembered and fewer still used. He had passed it dozens of times, perhaps more, each time with his head full of other thoughts. Sacks to carry, tools to mend, wood to split. The granary itself was a sturdy thing of thick beams and moss-dark stone, with its doors hung high to keep the grain dry and the mice wary. Most days, Edric came and went from the front, lifting barley, turning sacks, pausing now and then to scratch his beard or adjust his back. But this day, this warm blue-shadowed day, he stepped around the side to fetch a length of rope someone had left hanging from the eaves. And there it was, a narrow way, edged with dry leaves, and the quiet hush of old footfalls, leading into the dip behind the outbuildings where the hedges grew tall and untamed. No one had trimmed them in years. They leaned together at the top, forming a kind of crooked tunnel over the path, casting dappled shade in strange shifting shapes. He didn't go down it straight away. He stood and stared, hand still gripping the rope, something tugging at him from a place he couldn't name. It wasn't curiosity exactly, more like the feeling you get when a song comes back to you from a dream, not the tune, but the shape of it, the sense that you've heard it before in another time. Later, after the barley was stored and the doors barred, Edric returned, not with purpose, but with a kind of gentle wandering that didn't press for answers. He brought with him a heel of bread, a slice of dried plum, and a water skin, all tucked into a cloth. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't need to. The path crunched underfoot with old gravel, worn smooth by boots long gone. Brambles reached lazily across it here and there, and the hedges hummed with bees hiding in late blossoms. It smelled of dry grass and sweet nettle, of things that had been left alone long enough to belong only to themselves. He followed it slowly, tracing each bend with a quiet step, not rushing. Birds flitted through the hedgerow, small brown ones with quick wings, and overhead a kite wheeled silently, its shadow sliding across the field beside him. The deeper he walked, the more the noise of the village fell away. The clank of iron, the bleat of sheep, the shouted names, they faded, replaced by something softer, the sound of leaves shifting like whispers, the groan of trees grown thick with age. At one point, the path narrowed, then opened suddenly into a clearing edged with elder and holly, where an old stone wall sat crumbled and moss-covered. There was no house, no ruin even, but something about the place felt settled, like it had once been lived in, or watched over. Edric sat on a low stump and unwrapped his food, eating slowly, chewing each bite with care, letting the quiet fill his bones. He closed his eyes a moment, and let the sun warm the back of his neck. He remembered his father's voice, not the words but the tone of it, low and sure, like the sound of a cart wheel rolling steadily down a lane. He remembered a time he had been here before, not this path exactly, but somewhere near, chasing his brother with a stick, laughing until they couldn't breathe, falling into the grass, and pretending to be slain warriors. only to rise again when the wind picked up. He stood and wandered further, where the hedge bent around, and the path curved into another slope, rising gently toward the tree line. There he saw something odd, not out of place, but not expected either. A standing stone, no taller than his waist, sunk partway into the earth. Its surface was worn smooth, save for a single shallow groove that curved like a crescent. Moss grew in the hollow. Edric touched it, then stepped back, feeling no fear, only stillness. He stayed a long while, until the light began to change, not to darkness, but to that golden hue that touches everything just before dusk, when the world holds its breath. Then he turned and made his way back, slower still, marking each turn and bend in his memory. When he reached the granary again, it was nearly evening. The air had cooled, and the chimney smoke curled higher now as suppers began. He paused once more to glance behind him. The path was still there, but it looked different now, more ordinary somehow, less secret, or perhaps it had never been secret, only forgotten. That night, as he sat by his small hearth mending the strap on his boot, he thought again of the stone, the clearing, the hush beneath the hedges. He didn't feel the need to tell anyone about it. The path had been there long before him, and would be there long after. It was enough that he had walked it once more, and in the weeks that followed, whenever the day felt too heavy or his hands too tired, he would drift behind the granary, after chores, and walk a little way down the path, not always far, just far enough to find the silence again, and let it settle around him, like an old familiar coat. The ember in the coals. The nights had grown longer, and though the harvest was tucked safely away in sacks and bins, the village did not slow so much as it shifted. The rhythm of days turned inward. Less work in the fields now, more time spent at the hearth. Fires were lit earlier, and folk gathered around them like moths drawn to memory. In the cottage where Aldwyn lived, on the edge of the commons, just past the hazel thicket, the hearth had long been the heart of his home. The stones were worn smooth, not by tools, but by time, by the slow heat of countless winters, and the weight of stories shared over bread and broth. Aldwyn was not young, nor was he bent and broken, as some elders were. He walked upright, though slower now, and his hands, once quick with tools and rope, now moved with care, each motion deliberate. His face had lines not of sorrow, but of years well spent, creases formed by laughter, worry, and sun, all woven together. He woke before dawn most days, even when the cocks had yet to stir, and he would tend the embers, never quite letting the fire go out, not completely. There was a way to it, burying the coals in ash, so they held their heat, even through the night's deepest cold. Then, in the morning, he would uncover them gently, breathing them back to flame with dry bark and patient hands. It was a quiet thing, this tending of the coals, a small act, almost invisible to the rest of the village, but it mattered. The hearth was not merely warmth, it was light, memory, and the soft pulse of continuity. One morning, as the frost laced the window slits and the fields shimmered pale beneath the sky, Aldwyn uncovered the coals and found a single ember glowing brighter than the rest. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. He stared at it longer than usual. There was nothing unusual about it, just a coal, a bit more lively than its neighbors. But something in it stirred a thought he hadn't felt in years. He sat down beside the fire and let the idea settle. That ember reminded him of a night long ago, when he was no more than a lad, and the hearth had belonged to his mother. He remembered the way she had stirred the coals with a spoon carved from applewood, and how the light had caught her eyes, turning them gold. She had told him then that every fire was a kind of spirit, not a thing to fear, but to understand. It listens, she'd said, as she shifted the kindling. You just have to speak in the right way. He hadn't thought about that in years, but now, watching the coal glow, he wondered. When the fire caught fully, he placed a kettle to boil, then sat back and closed his eyes, letting the warmth reach into his fingers. Outside, the frost was hardening across the thatch. A pair of crows hopped along the frozen lane, pecking at something unseen. The village was still. Only a thin plume of smoke rose from the smith's roof, and even that curled slowly, hesitant to rise. Later that day, as Aldwyn walked the lanes with his walking stick, he found himself stopping more often. He noticed things, the way the light filtered through the hedgerow, or the way the chickens scratched not just for food, but out of sheer habit, the way old folk do when they can't remember why they entered a room. He passed a boy carrying firewood and nodded to him. The boy's hands were red with cold, and his tunic was patched, but he smiled all the same. Aldwyn pointed to the load and said, "Make sure you bury your coals tonight." The boy looked puzzled, but nodded respectfully. Aldwyn kept walking. That night, as wind brushed the eaves like a whispering hand, Aldwyn sat once more by his fire, watching the flames settle into low red light. He hadn't spoken much that day, not with words at least, but his thoughts had been loud. He remembered faces long gone, and names that now lived only on his tongue. He thought of how a village held its memory not just in books or stories, but in gestures, in the way bread was scored, or rope was tied, or embers were stirred, and he thought again of that single ember, the one that had glowed a little brighter than the rest. It had no message, no omen, it was only a coal, but in its glow he'd remembered the thread that tied him to those who came before, and those who would come after. He stirred the ash gently with his spoon, still the same one, carved years ago from applewood, and let the last of the flame fall into quiet. A few sparks leapt up, like thoughts refusing to settle. Then, with slow hands, he covered the coals for the night, whispering as he did so, not words, but the same silence his mother had once offered, a silence full of warmth and knowing. And as the cottage fell into stillness, and the wind passed softly overhead, the ember beneath the ash held its glow. The cart path after rain. The morning after a night of steady rain always changed the shape of the village. The familiar paths, usually hard-packed and dusty, had turned soft and rutted, their edges lost in puddles and the dark squelch of earth. The cart path that wound behind the grain shed and down toward the lower fields no longer bore the clear tracks of wheels. It was now a glistening, uneven ribbon of wet soil, bordered by waterlogged grass and the broken prints of hens and boots. Oswin had been up early, as he usually was when the clouds cleared. He stood at the head of the lane, holding a wooden pail in one hand and a bundle of feed wrapped in a linen cloth in the other. He wasn't a young man anymore, but the years had been kind. His back was straight, his step steady. His beard had silvered at the chin though, and his eyes moved slower when watching the skies for signs of change. The rain had come gently, tapping through the night like soft knuckles on a shutter. No wind, no thunder, only that slow, soaking fall that turned the village to mud and mist. It wasn't a bad thing. Everyone knew the earth needed such days, but it made work slower, quieter, and the fields harder to reach. Oswin stepped onto the path with care. The first squelch of his boot in the mud was always the worst part, that sudden cold rising through the soul. But once the step was taken, there was nothing for it but to go on. He moved slowly, avoiding the deepest pools, following the edges where the grass held a little firmness. The crows were already about, watching from the fence posts, black feathers ruffled from the damp. He was heading to the grain bins beyond the bend, past where the hedgerow broke into a slope. It wasn't far, but on a wet morning, it took twice the time. The wheels of the last cart to pass had carved deep lines in the mud, now half filled with water, and in some places, the path was little more than a guess between two pools. But Oswin didn't mind. There was something he liked about the way the world slowed down after a rain. The quiet was fuller, the colors were softer, even the birds seemed to wait longer before calling. He stopped at a low branch and set the pail down. There, on a leaf, a single drop of water trembled. It was caught in the crook of the stem, round and clear, holding a perfect, tiny image of the sky. Oswin watched it a while before moving on. He had seen such things many times, but that didn't make them any less worth noticing. Down the slope, near the shed, the ground leveled out. The old oak tree that stood just beyond the field had spread its leaves wide over the path, and though some rain had fallen through, the ground here was firmer, less waterlogged. Oswin reached the bins and began the simple task of checking them, making sure the lids were tight, the grain dry, no mice had chewed their way in during the storm. He worked in silence, his movements familiar. After a time, he sat on the low stone wall beside the bins, unwrapped his cloth bundle, and ate a few mouthfuls of oat bread and dried apple. The rain had left the air with a kind of cool sweetness, the scent of wet grass and damp wood thick in every breath. In the distance, a dog barked once, and then fell quiet. From his seat, Oswin could see the curve of the cart path winding back toward the village. The mist was still rising in places, and along the hedges, spiders' webs had caught the dew, turning them into silver nets that hung like woven lace. He sat there for a long while, letting the morning pass him by. There was no rush, not on a day like this. The hens would wait. The others would be waking now, opening shutters, wiping the windows dry. The smoke would begin to rise from the chimneys again, one by one, and voices would carry across the damp air, soft and slow. When he stood to return, Oswin took the long way back, following the curve of the path beyond the elm tree, where the puddles weren't as deep. He paused once more by the low branch with the droplet. but it had fallen while he was away. Only the stem remained, wet and trembling. Still he smiled, as he reached the rise before the village. He looked out over the roofs, the fields, the smoke trails curling skyward, like ink in water. Everything was touched by the rain, the stones, the fences, the doorposts, but it wasn't ruin, it was renewal, a kind of quiet washing. The cart path behind him would dry by midday, firm again underfoot, its puddles soaked back into the earth. But for now, it bore the soft impressions of boots and paws, of slow steps and passing wheels, and each mark was a record, not of haste or hardship, but of a morning well walked. The beekeeper's window. The sun had returned after 2 long days of rain, and with it came a soft warmth that coaxed the dampness from the thatch and the hedgerows. It was not a heat to sweat beneath, but a gentle radiance that warmed the shoulders and brought the scent of honey and ivy into the air. Near the edge of the village, tucked between the edge of the southern wood and a slow-moving stream, lived Maren, the village beekeeper. Her cottage was small and low, its door framed by climbing hops and old stones, and the window to the east, just above her work table, always held the first light of morning. This window had seen many seasons, and each pane of its imperfect glass warped the outside world just enough to make it shimmer like water. It was through this window that Maren had watched the bees come and go for years, always with the same quiet wonder. She rose before the sun most days, not out of necessity, but habit. There was something about the hour before light that soothed her. The fire in her hearth still crackled low from the night before, and she stirred it to life before placing a small clay pot of milk near the edge to warm. Outside, the bees still slept, tucked in tight combs within their wooden hives, dreaming in whatever way bees might. Her hive stood in a line beyond the back hedge, sheltered from wind, close to the wild flowers that would soon bloom in full again. Each hive had its own shape, some rounded, some square, all handmade, all cared for with the same tenderness she gave to every small living thing. She did not name her bees, but she knew their moods. She could tell when the air buzzed with ease, and when something troubled them, too much wind, the wrong kind of cold, or the scent of fox in the grass. That morning, Maren brought a stool to the window, and sat beside it with her warming cup. The bees would not rise for another hour, but already she saw their world beginning to stir. The leaves held a golden sheen, a blackbird hopped through the garden, picking at something hidden in the roots, and near the furthest hive, a single early riser, a worker, no doubt hovered just above the entrance, as if testing the air before deciding. She reached into the small wooden box beneath the table, and took out her wax cloth and a folded letter. The cloth she smoothed over the table, its scent of lavender and pine mingling with the warmth of the room. The letter, though, she did not open. It was old now, softened at the edges, the ink faded, but still legible. It was not from someone close by. It had come years ago, before she had taken on the hives, before she had come to this quiet edge of the world. Maren had no children of her own, no husband, but she was not alone. The bees were company enough, and the villagers, though they came to her only now and then, always with respect, spoke kindly of her, and never forgot to leave something small in thanks, a jar of grain, a pot of stew, or once, a stitched handkerchief with her initials sewn in blue. As the sun lifted further, the bees began to stir in earnest. From her window she watched them begin their day, the first flights cautious and wide, their paths slow and looping, then more confident as the warmth grew. They flew like threads weaving through the morning light, each bee carrying out its ancient work with no need for command or hurry. She opened the window a crack. The scent of the garden poured in, wet soil, drying leaves, the soft perfume of damp wood. The bees did not fear her. They passed by her window without pause, their wings humming in harmony with the breeze. A few would land on the sill now and then, crawling in lazy circles before lifting again into the sun. Maren set aside her cup and picked up her small knife and a bit of old comb. She trimmed it carefully, separating the wax into tidy piles, which she'd later melt down for candles. Each piece was handled with care, each cut slow and sure. Her fingers, though marked by age, still moved with gentle purpose. She had learned not to rush, not in anything. The bees had taught her that. In the afternoon, when the sun had moved past the highest pane and cast long bars of light across her floor, she stepped outside. The air was warmer now, and the bees swirled in the garden like a soft golden mist. She walked among them, humming low, not to calm them, but to let them know she was near. The sound of her voice, gentle and even, seemed to settle over the hives like a shawl. She checked the hives one by one, lifting lids with care, brushing away the few bees that lingered too close. The comb was healthy, full and golden, The queens were working, all was well. Back at the window, later she watched the sun begin its descent, casting the hives in slanting amber. The bees began to return, slower now, their flights heavier with pollen, and the day's work. They landed at the hive doors and vanished inside, one by one, until only a few late wanderers remained, circling once or twice before slipping into the shadowed comb. She closed the window at last. The warmth remained, clinging to the glass, to the stone, to the air itself, and as the fire whispered in the hearth behind her, and the bees grew quiet beneath the setting sky, Maren sat once more beside the window, watching the last of the light catch the wings of a single bee returning home. A loaf for the miller. The morning broke with the smell of baked earth, and the faintest chill of dew still lingering on the grass. In the quiet edge of the village, where the lane curved past the old well and disappeared into a tunnel of ash and birch, a figure walked slowly with a covered basket tucked beneath her arm. It was Elswith, the baker's niece, sent along just after sunup, with a loaf wrapped in linen and a few words folded into a note. The road to the mill was not far, but it wound through hollows where fog still drifted in soft layers above the ground. Elswith liked these walks, even if they were meant as errands. The stillness of the morning, the way the hedgerows held the light in their leaves, the sound of rooks calling in the distance. These things made her feel a little taller than she was, a little older, though she had barely passed 15 summers. The loaf she carried was for old Master Deegan, the miller, whose knees had grown stiff and whose firewood came late when the weather turned. He did not leave the mill often now, but the people still came to him, sacks in hand, and he worked as he always had, steady, slow, deliberate. As Elswith walked, she thought about the mill. It had stood there longer than any cottage in the village, older even than the chapel by the stream. Its wheel turned with a soft groan that you could hear before you saw it, and the scent of grain always lingered near its stone steps. When she reached the bend in the lane, she paused. The trees parted just enough to give her the first glimpse of the thatched roof, half covered in moss, and the old sign carved with a sheaf of barley swaying above the door. The wheel creaked in its rhythm, lifting water from the narrow runoff and letting it drop again with a sound like soft applause. A good sign, she thought. The wheel still turning meant the grain was grinding, and the miller was well. She stepped through the gate and knocked gently, though the door was already ajar. From within came the rustle of paper and the low cough of a fire being coaxed back to life. Master Deegan, wrapped in a thick woolen shawl and a stained apron, looked up from a small pile of dried lavender he'd been using to keep the weevils at bay. "A loaf from your aunt, I wager," he said with a thin smile, motioning her in. "And your own 2 feet to carry it. Sit, child. Let me pour you a bit of warm cider." Elswith stepped inside. The mill's interior was as she remembered, dusty with flour, warm with the smell of toasted grain and wood smoke. A cat dozed on a heap of burlap near the hearth. Tools hung from beams in neat lines. Every corner seemed shaped by years of habit. She handed him the loaf, still warm, and placed the folded note beside it on the table. He opened the cloth and smiled at the scent. "Still baking with rosemary and sea salt," he muttered. "Your aunt remembers what an old man likes." He poured the cider into a clay cup and passed it to her with a nod. She sat on the small stool by the hearth, hands wrapped around the warmth, listening as the wheel outside continued its slow, deliberate turning. "Mill's been good this spring," he said after a while, lifting the loaf to smell it again. "Rains came soft and the barley's plump. I've more work than my bones would like, but the grain's sweet this year, best in a while." Elswith nodded. She looked around the room, letting her eyes rest on the shelves of dried herbs, the stacks of ledgers, the bundles of oats hanging from the rafters. "Do you still keep the ledger with the odd flour marks?" she asked. The old man chuckled, reaching to a corner shelf and pulling down a worn leather-bound book. "Still here, still full of complaints about mice and notes about whose flour turned grey too quick." He handed it to her, and she turned the pages slowly, reading the faded lines that told small peculiar stories of lost sacks, of rain-soaked loads, of a time a goat had chewed through a whole bag while the miller's back was turned. Time passed softly between them. Outside, the breeze stirred the reeds along the water, and the wheel never stopped its work. When the sun rose higher, she stood. "I should go," she said. "There's barley to sweep, and my aunt'll be looking for the jug." The miller nodded, and walked her to the door. "Tell her I'll send the bran sacks tomorrow, and to keep that oven hot. This loaf's worth a basket of it." She stepped outside, her basket now empty, the jug warm in her hand from cider. She looked once more at the wheel, and the little mill house nestled into the slope of the land, and she smiled. The walk home felt lighter somehow, though the path hadn't changed. The morning had grown fuller, more bees in the clover, more voices in the air, even a pair of boys splashing stones into the stream down by the crossing. By the time she reached the bakery, her aunt was at the table kneading dough, sleeves dusted with flour. Did he eat it? The aunt asked, glancing over her shoulder. Smelled it, smiled and said he'd trade a basket of bran for another. Ellsworth said, setting the jug down. Her aunt gave a nod. Then I'll start the next, this time with sage. Ellsworth turned to the window, where the morning light now streamed freely through the glass. In the still warm silence, the scent of rosemary and baked wheat lingered in the air. Somewhere down the lane, the wheel of the mill turned on. Ashes beneath the ovenstone. The day had long since settled into the kind of gentle stillness that only came after days of soft weather. The fields were damp with memory. The stones in the road held the faint shimmer of dew even near midday, and from every chimney in the village, a fine ribbon of smoke rose in lazy threads toward a sky pale and kind. Down behind the cooper's yard, where the path curved along a sunken lane flanked by thick ferns and soft banks of nettle, there stood a low stone hut with a round roof of turf. It had no sign above the door, nor any lantern hung to mark it, but those who passed nearby in the early hours knew it well. This was where Mother Britha kept her ash. Mother Britha was not a healer, not precisely. She didn't speak charms or grind powders into poultices, though she'd done a bit of that in her time. Nor was she one of the quiet women who brewed teas with rue and chamomile, and spoke gently to those who'd lost their appetite. Britha had one task, and one only, to mind the old communal oven, and to keep the fire alive beneath the stone, no matter the weather, no matter the season. She had tended the oven since before the war, before the grain levies and the split harvest, before her son had gone off downriver to learn from the monks. The oven, with its broad blackened mouth and low domed belly, was as much her companion as any creature could be. Today she moved slowly, crouched on knees made stiff by weather and time, brushing the cooled ashes from the lip of the firebox. Her fingers were blackened, her apron smudged with soot, but her eyes, a pale grey like worn wool, were steady and sharp. Outside, the wind rustled the ivy that crept along the back wall, and somewhere in the distance, a woodcutter's axe struck rhythmically into a beech trunk. Inside, Britha placed a bundle of kindling beneath the coals and stirred gently with a willow stick. Sparks rose, glowing bright in the half-shadowed space, and caught. The oven had been lit just before dawn. Already it was warm enough to bake oatcakes and barley rounds, but Britha, as always, waited until the stones whispered to her. She knew their moods, these heavy slabs, knew when they needed more breath or more patience. No sandglass or sundial could tell the hour better than the curve of heat she felt beneath her palm. She remembered when she first learned to read the stones. Her grandmother had taught her, back when the oven had stood out nearer the old Roman road. Those were rougher days, when wood was scarce and bread thinner, but the heat still came true, always true. By noon, a knock came at the side door, a quiet thud, followed by the creak of hinges. It was John from the edge hall, carrying 2 long paddles of risen dough, wrapped in cloth, and a smile only half awake. "Bread's ready," he said, setting the boards down. "Can I leave it with you?" Britha gave a small grunt of approval, and lifted the cloth to see the shape of the loaves, tight, round, cleanly dusted with flour. "You've learned something since last time," she muttered. John laughed. "Only that underproofed dough is your worst enemy. Last batch went home with a scolding." "You deserved it," she said plainly, "but these'll bake true." She reached for her peel, and set to sliding the rounds into the oven, with a practiced grace. As the loaves disappeared into the warm breathing belly of the fire, she nodded. "Come back before second bell." He left without another word, as was her way. The oven did not like too much chatter. Alone again, Britha tended the coals, fed the fire just so, and swept the ashes into a wicker pan. She used the spent ash for soap, for scouring, for old remedies and newer tricks. Not a thing went to waste under her watch. Later, as the shadows stretched thin across the lane, and the golden light began to touch the curved roof of her hut, she opened the oven slowly. The scent of crust, of risen dough turned golden and hollow, filled the room like music. She tapped each loaf with her knuckle, listening not just for sound but for truth. A hollow ring meant it was done, full and sound. She wrapped them one by one in thick cloth, and set them near the door. Just then, another knock, softer this time. It was Annette, the Reeves' daughter, holding a small jug, and a worried look. "Mother Britha," she began, "I wondered if I might speak with you." Britha raised an eyebrow. "The oven's still warm. Sit by it." So the girl did, and in the hush between them, with the slow warmth of baking stones still radiating into the air, she began to speak, not of bread, but of troubles, a missed betrothal, a whispered slight. Britha listened, her hands never idle, folding cloth, sorting bundles of dried ash, knotting cords. She gave no advice, not the kind that sounded like sermons, only small things. There's strength in fire that stays low, not everything has to burn bright to mean something. Annette nodded slowly, watching the coals flicker. When the girl left, the loaves had cooled, and John had returned, nodding gratefully as he collected his round loaves for the long table at the edge hall. Britha sat once more by the hearth, the ash pan beside her. Outside, the light faded into the blue haze of early evening. A night wren called from the hedge. The stones beneath the oven held their warmth. She did not need thanks. She did not seek company. The oven spoke in crackles and sighs, and that was enough. In a world of seasons and fleeting things, the quiet labor of fire and bread went on, unspoken and true. Where the light falls last. There was a time not long ago, and not far away, when the days turned gently over the hills, and the lives of those who walked them left no great record behind. No stone monuments, no names carved deep into oak or slate, but here and there, in places the world forgot to hurry past, the light still fell softly on the quiet work of hands and hearth. The village, nestled in its shallow bowl of green, had not changed much. The old paths still wound between the rows of thatch and timber, and the same slow bell from the chapel tower still marked the hours. Even the wind knew its course, whispering through the barley stalks and between the mossy walls just as it always had. At the very edge of the south field, where the pastures gave way to meadow and the meadow to woods, a narrow footpath led beneath a leaning arch of elder trees. Few walked it often, but those who did remembered the way well, the press of earth beneath foot, the drowsy hum of bees where wildflowers nodded in the breeze, and the creak of old gates too proud to fall entirely. Beyond the trees, where the sun lingered longest before it dipped behind the western ridge, stood a small garden, half tended, half wild. A low wall wrapped around it like a circle of old arms, keeping little in and less out. And at the far side of that garden, on a rise where the earth was warm and dry, stood the last bench carved by the carpenter, who had long since gone to sleep beneath the yew. The bench was smooth with years and softened by rain. It faced nothing grand, just a broad sweep of hill and sky, and the slow dip of land toward the distant river. But it was here that people came, one by one, not for noise or counsel, but to sit and remember. Sometimes it was the wheelwright, pausing before the evening mists. Sometimes the children, quiet at last, their feet dangling above the thyme. Sometimes just a stranger passing through, drawn by nothing more than the feel of the path beneath their feet. They left little behind. A woven sprig of rosemary, a stone polished smooth by hand, a carving of a bird no bigger than a thumb, tucked into the bench's corner, quiet things. Forgotten by most, but not by the land. And if you listened, not just with your ears, but with the part of you that still believed in the turn of seasons and the weight of silence, you could almost hear them. The murmur of old names spoken gently by leaves, the echo of laughter folded into the bark of trees, the rustle of hands weaving flax into thread and bread into memory. The sound of lives lived low and deep, like the roots of the hedgerows that bound each field. No tale was ever written of this village, no banner ever hung to tell its triumphs. Yet here, in the work of the morning and the stillness of the dusk, there was a greatness that did not ask to be seen. It lived in the calloused hand that helped another rise, in the warmth of coals left glowing through the night, in the care taken with a loaf of bread, in the hush of snow on thatch, in the unseen kindnesses, too small for the ledgers of kings, but great enough to shape the soul of the earth. And so the days went on, as they always had. The harvest came and went, and new children were born into the rhythm of rain and grain and firelight. The night skies wheeled overhead in their vast silent watch, and the people below them, peasants, laborers, keepers of small things, moved gently through their hours, not forgotten, just unseen. But sometimes, in the stillest part of evening, when the air was golden and the shadows long, you could walk the old path one last time, past the gate, under the elder branches, to the place where the light fell last, and there, if you sat and stayed a while, the land might remember you too. If you've come with us this far, thank you. These stories were never about grand deeds or famous names. They were about the quiet ones, the steady hands, the worn paths, the everyday lives that shaped the world without ever asking to be remembered. If these chapters brought you a moment of stillness, or helped you wander gently toward rest, we're glad you found your way here. If you'd like to hear more stories like these, of old lives, forgotten places, and the soft turns of time, feel free to like this video, or leave a comment below. We read each one, and your words help guide what we share next. And if you'd like to return again, when the world feels heavy or the day too long, consider subscribing. There's always another path to follow, and another quiet story waiting just beyond the hedge. Until then, rest well, and may the light fall gently wherever you are.